So thank you all for joining with me today. My name is Makda. The purpose and goal of this panel discussion is to create a space where individuals from different ethnic backgrounds can have open, respectful, and insightful dialogue about the political and humanitarian climate the Horn of Africa is currently facing. There is an absence of space for interethnic dialogue, which is a significant root cause and barrier to resolving problems within regions. With that being said, our intentions are to cultivate and normalize discussing conflicts amongst interethnic groups. I think we can all agree this is a much needed conversation, and we hope to exemplify that dialogue can be held within our community respectfully with a mindset of conflict resolution. I will start with Sam. Please introduce yourself and give a little bit of a background of who you are.
Hi, everyone. I'm Samuel Gabriel. I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I am a political and nonprofit consultant. I'm also a former candidate for Cambridge City Council in Massachusetts. And I've been heavily involved in local issues here in the US for the last 15 years and also in Ethiopia as well. So it's great to be here with all of you. I'm really excited to talk about the different issues that the Horn of Africa faces and sort of what are some ways out of it. You're on mute.
Thank you. Mastish, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Mastish. I was born and raised in Addis, did most of my schooling there, and then started sort of graduate school and undergrad in politics and law. So that's my academic background. But I have spent also recently a year in Ethiopia with some of the reform initiatives that were launched with Prime Minister Abiy. So I'm really interested in obviously the Horn and Africa broadly, but what we can do to sort of salvage the situation back in Ethiopia right now, the current crisis.
Thank you, Mastish. Mark, do you mind introducing yourself and a little bit of your background?
Yeah, my name is Mark Goidam. I'm based out of the Bay Area, Santa Rosa, California specifically. I have been involved, I guess you could say, with Eritrean activism and focusing on how to kind of make Eritrea a better place. And for building on about 8 years now. And besides that, I'm a registered nurse, a husband, a father, all the basic stuff. And I've also been involved with like local politics and things like that, just trying to make my local community better also. And I guess I would self-describe myself as a Pan-African Eritrean. I've lately figured out that that's the best way, I think the easiest way to describe myself.
Thank you, Mark. Ayantu, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ayantu. I'm a PhD student, a researcher, and an activist. I live in Los Angeles, and I'm really looking forward to hearing different perspectives. Yeah.
Thank you. And lastly, Andam.
Hey everyone, what's up? My name is Andam Gabriel. I'm from Mount Vernon, New York, right outside New York City. Mostly been a special education teacher for much of my professional career. Recently, I ran for Congress here in New York City metro area. And as an Eritrean, as a justice-minded person, very concerned by what's happening back in the Horn of Africa. So really looking forward to this conversation with everyone.
Thank you. So I'm just going to dive into the first question. What is your opinion on the root cause of this civil war and the major obstacles being faced within the Horn of Africa?
I think that's a heavy question. I'll start off. So as far as like the root cause of what's going on, I think I would have to say at the very root of it would probably be some form of neo-colonialism. I feel like it's always kind of been into the benefit of outside powers, right, for African people to not succeed. I think oftentimes we hear about all the natural resources that is in Africa, all all of the basically just the potential that Africa holds, but not being able to kind of reach that potential. So in my personal opinion, I would say at the root cause, I think would definitely have to be neocolonialism, because when you look at what's going on in other nations, that also seems to be the case, not just in the Horn of Africa. So I guess that's my answer. And then what was the end of that question? Could you repeat that real quick?
The major obstacles being faced within the Horn of Africa.
Yeah, and then I think due to neocolonialism, I think the major obstacles is trying to figure out how to bridge the divide between people, how to kind of overcome our differences that we either think we may have or we actually do have, and working together to kind of achieve that. So I think definitely that's the major obstacle I think that we face is figuring out our common goals and working towards that.
Yeah, I could jump in here. I think going back to, I guess, what I know more in detail, like the Ethiopian context, I think that what Mark just said about resolving our differences in a civilized way, in a way that doesn't, end up in military confrontation, like what we're seeing back in Ethiopia now, is like the key, I think, problem. And I think a lot of it, at least in the Ethiopian and perhaps even Eritrean context, is having a political system that tolerates differences and has means for them to be sort of moderated in a peaceful way. So not just like a constitution and parliament, but institutions that are kind of germane in this country, but like courts that are independent, and some institutes as part of the executive that can be relied on for some impartial, public-minded service. So just institutions, I think in general, like we haven't built them for decades. There's like, a shift of like one regime promising that and then turning into a authoritarian, dictatorship. So I think the common thread is just an inability to build the institutions that would allow us to resolve our differences, because the differences will be there forever. It's just how to resolve them. So that's what I feel about sort of the root cause.
To add on to that, I agree with Maswell. I think differences are not necessarily bad, right? I think any society is going to have differences. The question is, how do you sort of negotiate with those differences? And certainly in the Horn of Africa, and you could argue throughout the continent, there's a lack of institution building. And to Mark's point as well, it's sort of, you think about the geopolitics of the Horn. It's a very militarized region. It has seen more than its fair share of war throughout the last century, and a lot of instability, a lot of state and non-state actors that seek to destabilize the region. And so there are layers and layers to this. And in addition to all of that, correctly said, Mark, there are, in many of these contexts, there are colonial borders. There are long unresolved ethnic and religious disputes. I mean, even Ethiopia, which we oftentimes proudly say was the only country in Africa never to be colonized, the reality is that it is also an empire that expanded and also shrunk through brute force. And so, it's not like everybody sort of was just living under happily under the sun. So there's some nuance there. Yes, maybe it wasn't colonized by a foreign power or a Western power, but there was indeed conquest among what is today Ethiopia. And so there's so many layers to this, and I just think that a lot of this just has to deal with unresolved grievances and the reality that instead of the politics of possibilities, the politics of reconciliation, what we like to do in the Horn of Africa often is the politics of personalities and quite frankly, the politics of annihilation. And so instead of finding ways to bridge differences and instead of finding the ways to celebrate and embrace the ways in which we differ, it usually comes down to a zero-sum game of power. And for me to have power, I have to eliminate you.
Okay. Okay. Can I just jump on that point? I think that both all of you have touched on really important points, so I don't want to repeat them. But I do want to reiterate the unequal relationship that developed after the late 19th century, when the power dynamics in the Horn of Africa shift completely, as they did in the rest of Africa with the scramble for Africa carried out by European states. And I think that we have not addressed that fundamental loss of sovereignty and autonomy for people who were previously independent and then who were incorporated into the state in Ethiopia. I'm just speaking about Ethiopia right now, and who continue to be disfranchised and systemically subjugated. Sam used a really good term, politics of annihilation. This is like our whole political approach in Ethiopia is about annihilating communities one at a time, gradually. There are communities that are continuously subjected to the state's impulse of annihilation, and it never stops. And I think that, and whenever there is an opening, what Mark is talking about, about neo-colonial, Ethiopia is a neo-colonial entity from the way I see that. I don't think it's any different than any other African country in that sense. And when there is opening for change, you'll have, say, the US or another neo-colonial power will then come in and put in power their own people and sustain that dictatorship and that authoritarian government, even at the expense of millions of lives of people. Abiy Ahmed is a good example. He has started 2 wars and he still continues to benefit. He still continues to be a benefactor of the goodwill of the international system. So the international system is a big part of our problem as well.
Yeah, I'll jump in on the last point, where I think that it's interesting in the sense of all African states of how the states broadcast power, how they're able to assert their sovereignty, assert that power throughout the boundaries of the state, and then what does sovereignty look like in a lot of these states. In the context of the Horn of Africa, I think it's interesting both on a national context and regionally, and then also in terms of how we engage, we meaning these Horn of African states, with regional apparatuses and international institutions. In the context of this conflict, we're going back to the beginning of November, right? Abiy is saying that this is a national issue, right? And that for the African Union, right, we have to think about this in terms of, non-indifference, right? Are we going to invade? There's going to be, crimes against humanity. Well, Abiy's like, no, this is a national issue, even though we know that this conflict is automatically going to be internationalized because of refugees moving across the border. And then when you think about Eritrea in this context, Eritrea from the very beginning is looking forward to, this is my own opinion, Eritrea is looking at this and the opportunity to internationalize as a benefit to their ability to broadcast state power and assert their authority and concretize that power within the PFDJ regime. So when we're talking about obstacles, I think root causes and obstacles, they feed into each other. There's no sort of line where it's like, oh, this was the cause. And no, this is a continuous process, because in so many of our countries, particularly in Ethiopia, where there's always been this sort of challenge, as many of you guys have already said, with sort of subnational groups being able to have rights within the country and be able to sort of assert their power. I think we're going to see these issues for a very long time, especially when when COVID ends, when we have this new slate of national elections in Ethiopia. Well, what's that going to look like after we have this huge war?
Question is what is your individual perspective of this civil war as an Eritrean, as an Ethiopian, as a Tigrayan, as an Oromo, as an Amhara, as any ethnic background that you stand behind or are somewhat identified by?
I'll go, considering I'm sort of the victim in all of this. But I think the challenge here is, again, if you put politics aside for a second, right? Because going back the last few months, there has been dueling narratives and a lot of hostility and a lot of inflammatory rhetoric, and numerous actors in Ethiopia had multiple opportunities to really de-escalate and find meaningful ways to resolve disputes. So putting all that aside for a moment, I think the thing that really angers a lot of Tigrayans, especially those of us in the diaspora, is what we see as a collective form of punishment. And this is not just in Tigray. I mean, there are a lot of other ethnic groups in Ethiopia that have experienced this, not just in the past 2 years, but also really, I mean, throughout modern Ethiopian history. And so, the blackout of telecommunications, the complete blockade of the region, where critical medicine, critical basic services, including food, fuel, etc., are all in really short supply. This is just inhumane. And there's real talk, and Master Wala, I mean, you're an attorney, so you can talk more about this, but there's real talk about are there violations of international humanitarian law? Are there war crimes being committed here? And for a lot of Tigrayans, ultimately the psyche is, if you go back through just the past century in Ethiopian history, the Italians bombed Ethiopia, but I mean Tigray in this context. Emperor Haile Selassie bombed Tigray. Colonel Mengistu Haile-Mariam bombed Tigray. Isaias Afwerki bombed Tigray, and now Abiy Ahmed is bombing Tigray. And so the idea of airstrikes, blockades, those sorts of things, it brings back a lot of old wounds and a lot of trauma. And so when people see this, especially when Tigrayans see this, it's very hard not to get angry and also emotional. And so when you talk to your ordinary Tigrayan, they'll tell you over the last 4 weeks, many of us haven't slept and we've been preoccupied, obviously, with this war. But I would say that the cruelest thing of all of this is the telecommunications blackout. At least if there was telecom, you could call your loved ones every hour just to make sure they were alive. And so the humanitarian crisis of this, and I think in war, we often forget that. I mean, even the Eritrea-Ethiopia war in 1998-2000, both governments still are not honest about how many people died. We estimate up to 100,000 people. We don't really know. You saw what happened this summer in Oromia. I mean, it's really inappropriate. I think we forget the humanity of war, or the human toll of war. And I think that's something that needs to be discussed more.
I can jump in if people are thinking. What I think about it as, so just, I think I stated my background that I grew up in Addis, but I was born to an Amhara parent, so I know the sort of the Amhara perspective very well in terms of the build up as well as what's going on right now. So I do hear that from my parents, but for my dad, for example, but I wouldn't. So I will be very, I know a lot of people dismiss the Addis Ababa crowd as like confused or like hidden Amhara, like there's like a really interesting stereotype of that, but I am part of that crowd that kind of really maybe imagines like an Ethiopia that can have a multi-ethnic political sort of environment where politics is not going to be primarily defined by ethnicity. So, and this is all like, I'm processing a lot of the groups now, like re-meeting some people that I thought I knew, and all. So my thoughts about this are evolving right now, but I subscribe to the view that we need to ultimately reach that stage where, neither religion or ethnicity or other, identity will be like a fundamental sort of a framework through which we organize our politics. So in that perspective, I see this conflict as sort of, and what happened in the past 2 years, let's say. There were 6 months of euphoria, which, in which I was very, hopeful. And then I kind of saw some of it sliding down. So that period, I see it as like really a letdown, like all the excitement and all the hope that Ethiopians had for the country and what we could do with the revolution, the silent revolution, let's say, that was led by the Oromo youth and then other youth groups that joined. But it was a huge contribution. That group, and that generation had for the country and what it could become was incredible. I mean, if you guys remember sort of the vibe back in 2018. So for me, it was, it particularly affects, like Sam said, like this is a really emotional, what's happening is really emotional for some people, very personal. And I understand that. The way I see it though is like, we are thrown back into that cycle of grievance and another cycle of war that will breed another one. So that's how I see it. It's just a complete like disappointment in how what this means for the process of like democratization and building institutions and whatnot. So yeah.
Okay, let me jump in. So Mastish, hopefully at some point you can say more about what you mean by like, how do you see a post-ethnic Ethiopian political culture? Because as you know, for Addis Ababa crowd, and I don't want to misrepresent them, I make fun of them a lot, but basically, as far as the Addis Ababa elites, or as far as Addis Ababans are concerned, since 1991, Ethiopia has just gone down the hill, and that is the product of what they call ethnic federalism, what the constitution calls multinational federalism, and they see the recognition of the rights of historically marginalized groups and the recognition of Ethiopia as a multinational state as the beginning of the end of what they see as this ancient state, and that it's created all the problems Ethiopia has. As an Oromo, I don't speak for all Oromos, obviously, like we're 40 million plus people. As an Oromo, I just feel that this war is part of the broader strategy to strip all peoples, but especially historically marginalized people, of the little gains that they've made in terms of linguistic rights, in terms of cultural rights, in terms of some of the demands they have to be recognized as a people, as a collective. And for me, the question is, can Ethiopia actually recognize its multi-ethnic identity? Because it almost feels like the last 30 years were, because there are people in Ethiopia who are structurally empowered enough that they can assert themselves so strongly, but those people are a minority. And that's not to say minorities should not be heard. They should be heard, but I think they should be part of this broader, conversation. So I'll leave it there for now, unless, just one I wanted to add. And also, as Mastish was saying, Abiy Ahmed came to power as a result of this youth-led Oromo grassroots movement that was also joined by other youth. And when you look at those youth, they've been demonized throughout the protests and after the protests. Thousands of them remain in jail where they've been over the last year, and especially since Haj al-Hundessa was assassinated at the end of June. When I look at the way Tagaru people are being demonized today, it's almost identical to how Oromo youth were demonized during and after the protests. And I also recognize that the demonization of the Tagaru didn't begin with this last 4 weeks. It's been kind of there since Abiy Ahmed came to power. So there's this, I see like this repeating of patterns, because during the 1990 transition, when the TPLF was sort of kicking out the OLF and all the other legitimate leaders, one of the things it was doing was going after everybody in the name of being OLF. And now I see Abiy Ahmed doing the same thing, and these cycles continue. And like, how do we break them? I feel like that's where we're stuck.
For me, I'll sort of talk about this in two ways. I'll talk about it first from just growing up here as an American of Eritrean descent, and then I'll talk about what I see going on in Eritrea specifically. But growing up here, first of all, no one even knows about Eritrea. You know, very often when we have to explain who we are, it's either, you know, you're referencing Ethiopia, hopefully if they even know Ethiopia, but many times it's just like, you know, we come from a place in East Africa. So, you know, when you grow up here, very much all of us are flattened in sort of inside blackness or flattened under this sort of homogenous idea of Africa. And so I feel for those of us who are first generation and Americans and born here, you know, I always felt I had tons of unity, you know, Pan-African mark, you know what I'm saying, man? I felt like I had tons of unity with all peoples of the continent, but particularly people in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia especially. And so it's been a little bit, well, not a little bit, it's been very disconcerting to see as this conflict, and you know, it's been going on the last couple of years, but particularly in this conflict, to see people who in all other ways you somewhat align, you know, they got the Black Lives Matter fist, you know, they're somewhat progressive in other ways when it comes to American issues. But then when it comes to talking about what's going on in Ethiopia, where again, like we know that there are horrific ethnic attacks, you know, the collective punishment that Samuel was talking about is very real, but I'm just like, wow, I'm hearing like genocidal rhetoric from people who in any other circumstance, you know, I would feel like we have so much more in common. So that's been just like really, really depressing to see. And that's all on top of, again, like the real, you know, all the deaths again, that we don't really know the numbers of them because of the blackouts. You know, as thinking about this from an Eritrean perspective, again, as Ayantu said, not speaking for everyone, but just sort of thinking about this from my own identity lens, you know, like connecting it with the question before about obstacles. You know, have we mentioned this guy Isaias, right? Like the obstacle that his presence, his regime, the effect that it has not only on the country, but all our people throughout the diaspora in the region is, you know, is terrible and extremely concerning. And for a lot of Eritreans, why when the Nobel Peace Prize was given to Abiy, the sort of legitimization of Isaias and his regime was, you know, really worrying. I think in terms of, you know, this conflict, from an Eritrean perspective, the ways in which Eritreans are getting involved with this, again, I'm not trying to minimize what's going on in Ethiopia. I'm just trying to speak about that. You know, we're seeing conscripts again being forced to fight. We know that Eritrea was involved right in the shelling of Humera and on the border of Sudan. You know, what's going on with Eritrean refugees, close to 100,000, and we're seeing that, you know, because of basically there's really no food aid going in, right? The food insecurity, what's happening to the people. We're hearing that the Eritrean military is abducting people and taking them back to Eritrea to, you know, be meted out punishment by the regime that they fled from because of military conscription, close political climate, all of these things. So all of that is really concerning. And it's also concerning, think about it again from like, again, why is Isaias and the PFDJ sort of thinking about this? Is it because they want this sort of unity with Abiy because they see it as necessary because of like their sort of flailing economy and they can't deal with like the threats that they have? You know, like when in 2018, you know, there was controversy because Isaias, you know, said Abiy was our leader. And so a lot of people saw, many Eritreans who are very, very assertive of their sovereignty saw a lot of problems with that. But even if you're not assertive of your sovereignty, like what the hell does that mean? I don't know what that means. But then on the other side, it's like, okay, I mentioned before about election moving forward. Abiy recently was talking about, okay, like now that we've secured victory, I'm calling on Tigrayan refugees, I'm calling on internally displaced people to come back to Tigray. And well, there's a whole lot of reasons why one might not feel comfortable to go back to Tigray, right? Like you're fearful of attacks, of punishment, like you don't know what's gonna happen. So for me, is like, is this the balkanization of Ethiopia? What is the balkanization of Ethiopia potential? I don't wanna speak negatively or put things out there that you know, could cause like a serious harm, but if there's this balkanization that comes into effect, what does that mean for a country where already we've seen far-right populism and ethno-nationalism and really just extremist rhetoric, again, even from people who live here in America. But then also, what does that mean for Eritrea? And what does that mean for Isaias as now his power is being able to become stronger with a weakened Ethiopia? So all of those things are thoughts that I have no answers to, but it's very concerning.
And I like that I get to go after Ando. We're the only ones that get to have the privilege of speaking after a Eritrean perspective, right? Makes it a little easier. Like Ayantu and Ando said, definitely not speaking for the whole Eritrean population, but my personal perspective as an Eritrean on this issue. One thing that I love that one reason that I really love that we're doing this dialogue is because I feel like if we understand each other's perspectives, then we can avoid these issues, right? Because Mastish kind of spoke earlier about like this hope that she had, right, with Abi, and this like sense of optimism and all that positivity. But I think as an Eritrean, as soon as we saw that he was doing a peace deal with Eritrea, like people who probably weren't from Eritrea or weren't really well versed on the history of Eritrea were probably like, oh wow, this is awesome, right? Like these two countries that have always been at war are finally getting along. But Eritreans know that if you as an Ethiopian prime minister are not condemning the Eritrean leadership for not having a constitution, not having freedom of speech, having more jails than universities, right? We don't even have a university. We just have like colleges and technical institutes and stuff like that. Forced military conscription, like everything that Eritrea represents, for you to make peace with somebody like that and not condemn that was like should have been a huge red flag to everybody, right? But I think that's part of us understanding each other's different perspectives, and me included, right? Because I don't understand like south of Addis Ababa as well as I should, which is why I'm like happy to kind of start opening up these type of dialogues. And so and to kind of piggyback off of what Andom was saying about the comments that dictator Isaias Afwerki was making, right? He was saying things like, yeah, all the governorship, all the power that I have is now with you, basically, right? Abiy Ahmed was at a African Union meeting, and dictator Isaias wasn't there, and he said that I'm representing Eritrea, right, at one of those meetings. And what else? There was some, and then also the very interesting thing, right, as an Eritrean too, was dictator Isaias Afwerki, like since over about 20 years, right, around the border war, 1998, he really put out this rhetoric of like anti-Wayane, but it also was anti-Tigray at the same time, right? Tigrayan people. And so it was like a real propaganda campaign to really divide those people. And then we went into a border war, and that kind of solidified divisions and solidified hate in the border and in the diaspora, right? And the thing that was really just mind-blowing to a lot of people was somebody who caused so much division suddenly was saying things like, this Ethiopian prime minister has the power, to rule over us, or, like kind of handing us over, to this new leadership. So it was very curious. And then he was saying things like, those people who don't, those Eritrean people who say Eritreans and Ethiopians are not brothers, don't know their history, they don't know the truth. And I actually love that comment just in a vacuum, right? Because we are brothers and sisters, but the way in which he said it and in the context was just, it was out of left field. It was very curious, to say the least. So, and then to continue on as an Eritrean perspective too, like all we've ever known, all dictator Isaias Afwerki has ever used us for is for war, in the same ways in which colonizers use this, right? Just to accomplish their goals. And furthermore, Eritrea is like was at least a population of about 6 million. And we kind of rival a lot of countries as far as refugees per capita, like refugee production, which is kind of crazy. Like there's like thousands of Eritreans fleeing every month, and that has been the case since about 2006 or so. I think it was like in the hundreds in 2006, but then started reaching into the thousands every month of Eritreans fleeing into Sudan, into Ethiopia, going towards, going up through Libya to get to the Mediterranean Sea, to get to Europe and whatnot, into Israel and all that. We had, so this war is nothing positive, and we know for a fact. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not to say we. I know for a fact that Eritrea definitely has a hand in it, because I think we understand that dictator Isaias Afwerki has said things like "game over," right? Which he's kind of like provoking, like saying like this enemy of mine that I've had for all these years. Now I've got my friend in the capital of Addis, and we're gonna basically attack. And so this definitely isn't a surprise to us. I think, yeah, it was just basically expected, I could say.
Okay. I was just gonna say like two things very quickly. One is that, so Mark was just saying, like, you know, looking at the personalities and you know, some of these actors like Isaias, he's been there for decades. So like the history, the record of these personalities is known, the people know it. And we also know what dictatorships generally look like, having lived through them in Ethiopia as well as in here. So what fascinates me right now in Ethiopia in terms of the popular support for this war, as well as the perception of Isaias' role in Ethiopia right now, is that especially the young people, okay? So there is a generation that, you know, has grievances and irrationally wants to act on that, you know, despite the consequences of it. But then there's young people who obviously grew up under TPLF, EPRDF, but, you know, should know better, I would think, because the stakes are really high for us. Like Mark was saying about, you know, Eritrean refugees crossing the borders, dying in, you know, in the Missy, and also like being enslaved, you know, this is like daily news. So knowing that, young people cheering, you know, this type of distraction and not thinking, given like a week or 2 weeks to think about what the consequences are. For me, I think that's where I'm arriving right now. Is like, I think the solution really is about how do we help people, you know, think a bit critically about what's going on in their countries and their local and, you know, sort of state and other level, you know, political environment, because we don't think critically. And I think that has to do with like the education system that we had to go through, and I guess goes to, you know, root problems. This might be the other root problem, that it's not just the dictatorships, but the types of political systems we had, you know, either deliberately or, you know, by default made the production of youth that can't like critically think and push and respectfully object to authority. So that's why. So one thing that really fascinates me is that how young people who should know better are cheering this war. So just this point.
Yeah, I agree with you, Master. So three things, building on what you just said about education. So while Ethiopia has made significant gains over the last 3 decades in access to education, quality to education has been abysmal. And so the quality of the educational system, to your point, I mean, Ethiopia is pushing out you know, hundreds of thousands of university graduates every year, but they're not critical thinkers. And this is actually a problem because even for economic development, a lot of companies that sort of require higher level thinking and technical skills that are trying to invest in Ethiopia find it very hard to do so because a lot of the young students who are graduating universities are not really critical thinkers. They're great at doing things, they're great at executing things, but they're not sort of your higher level management type or higher level decision maker. And so that's a real problem. And it's even more of an issue because 75% of Ethiopians are under the age of 30 estimated, right? So this is an incredibly young country. The continent as a whole, over 60% of 1 billion Africans are under the age of 25. And so solving for this, I think, is going to be a big thing. And that's why I keep saying time and again, and I've really tried to push it out over the last 4 weeks, our common enemy as Ethiopians, as Africans, as Horn of Africans, as Eritreans, whatever, is poverty. That's the common enemy here, because it's the poverty that is keeping people in a sort of limited type of thinking. 2 other things really quickly. One is on the case of Eritrea, like, you know, my mom was born in Asmara, you know, she's from Tigray, and she grew up in Asmara. You know, we have a lot of family and friends who live in Eritrea. And so the normalization of relations between those two countries, you know, at a human level, to Mark's point, you know, was a great thing. We are brothers and sisters. We are intermarried, especially Tigrayans and Eritreans. There's deep bonds there. And so to see sort of the lifting of a Berlin Wall, really, I mean, that's what there was essentially, was a great thing. You know, it was a wonderful for, you know, an uncle of mine was able to visit from Mekelle to Asmara to see relatives. We were able to pick up the phone and like call each other, right? That those lines were disconnected for 20 years. And so on a human level, there were some phenomenal things that occurred in 2018, 2019. But politically and structurally, I agree. And this is sort of where the honeymoon ended for me with Abiy, because like Mastwal and many others, for the first 6 months, I was like, whoa, is this new? Is this the thing? Is this the great big hope that we've been waiting for? And you know, the normalization of Isaias in particular was a huge red flag for me, because I knew what that meant for my Eritrean sisters and brothers, but I also knew what that meant for Tigray and for all of Ethiopia. And so this is a few weeks ago, as soon as the war on Tigray broke out, I was talking to a former diplomat, and the first thing she said to me was, this whole thing has Isaias's fingerprints all over it. And I said, yeah, I mean, this is unprompted, was the first thing she said to me. But yes, that is something we need to work on. To your point, you know, game over Wayana was like the first thing he said. And you know, it's important to also couch this in the fact that the TPLF and you know, the EPLF, the PFDJ, never really liked each other. You know, the sort of romanticized narrative is that they were brothers in arms. That's actually not true. They were allies of mutual convenience because they had to unseat Mengistu for both of their objectives to be accomplished. And so I see a lot of that with Abiy and Isaias now, where it's not an institutional partnership. It's not a partnership between Eritrea and Ethiopia. It's a partnership between two leaders who have a common enemy, who have a common threat. And so I wonder if you know, this war on Tigray has been achieved, like Abiy is saying, what is next for the relationship between Isaias and Abiy? I'm not sure any of us really know, because we still don't really know what they signed either. The agreement that they signed is still not public. And then very lastly, I hope we talk about the sort of dive deeper with the Addis Ababa crowd, because I actually think that Addis Ababa is like its own ethnic group in many ways, because whether you're Amhara or Tigrayan or whatever, I mean, like there are many friends that I have who were born and raised in Addis and don't really identify readily with any immediate ethnic group, just because you know, these metropolitan areas are such a melting pot in many ways. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but I do hope that we can dive a little deeper on that, because it's very fascinating.
Yeah, before we move forward, I was actually hoping that you guys could talk about that, because as a Eritrean, I'm not really privy to what you guys are really speaking to. So I would love to hear more about that, if you don't mind, Mastish and Ayantu.
Let me respond to Ayantu. She threw a very tricky question in there. So here's the thing. I think when Addis Ababa people, and I'm learning Ayantu now, like I'm actually meeting my friends like for the first time again, because I'm like, I thought you actually believed in X, and now like I feel like you weren't, you know, authentic about what you believe. But I think for me, genuinely, I think ethnicity currently in Ethiopia is part of the, you know, popular imagination more than other identities, obviously. And I don't think it's something that is necessarily bad or something that has to be like abolished or sort of legislated out, you know, like some people are hoping to do now with the change of the constitution. But I think the Addis Ababa crowd, it really feels like with the sort of emergence of multi-ethnic parties that are, I think, cognizant of the country's very complicated and really sad also history of grievances and lots of sort of injustices, right? Parties that recognize that can build a type of politics that will compensate for those things, but still allow us to like sort of imagine a multi-ethnic Ethiopia and one that's not going to be sort of putting rights and obligations on the basis of, or entitlements on the basis of ethnicity. And I think generally, I think that's a healthier society where, you know, the identity that you're born to just by happenstance, just because you're born to an Amhara parent or an Oromo parent or a mixed parent, you're not entitled to anything, or you're not deprived of anything. I think in principle, that's what I believe. In Ethiopia, the history, sort of the pre-1991 history, is romanticized by, now I believe, the majority of Addis Ababa clique or the Addis Ababa group that is kind of labeled as the unitarist, right, or the Ethiopianist, is romanticized for the reason that, people think, Ethiopians just loved each other, lived happily, never thought of ethnicity and language and all. Everybody spoke, what they spoke, and they just loved each other, right? And lived for, centuries until the TPLF came or EPRDF came and said ethnicity is important and legislated it or like constitutionalized. I don't buy that. And I think there are people who say, oh, we don't believe in this, but they actually do. And I saw that coming out in the past, 4 weeks. But I think that that narrative is wrong. But I also think the narrative that, everything and, prior to a recognition of ethnic grievances is dark is also not true. So I think that there is, like most countries that were characterized by conquest, like there's a lot of history that we have to deal with, we have to confront it, we have to speak about it, and then legislate and put in place policies that will address the systematic grievances, but then chart a way forward that doesn't really just stick to that. So that's what I subscribe to. But I will give you guys that like maybe I'm learning. Most of my friends who I thought believed the same way may not necessarily believe that.
Thank you for clarifying, Mastish. I think I want to go back to something Sam said about Ethiopia being this like Addis Ababa being this like metropolitan space, because I think that I have a lot of friends who are a lot of Oromo friends who are, and also Southern friends who are from in and around Finfinne. And for a lot of them, especially for my Oromo friends who are Tulama, as we know, Addis Ababa was founded in 1886 on Tulama land. There was entire people, entire history, entire governance system, entire culture that was destroyed in the building of Addis Ababa. And for Oromos, that city is very alienating because everything Oromo, including the people who still are on the land, have been stripped out and there's no space for it. And so people in Addis who feel like their identity is represented in that space, who are Amharic speakers, and this is across different ethnic groups. It's not just Amhara. I'm not using that as a code word. It's the people who have come to this space. When Addis Ababa was founded as a garrison town, where settler soldiers with their guns literally subjugated the people and kept them from pushing back against the conquest. So that history is still with us. I was in a taxi in 2019, and there was this kid who got on the taxi and he didn't speak Amharic, he spoke Afan Oromo, and the taxi conductor was just so dismissive and so rude. And I was just for me, it's so common, but that really pissed me off, because why should that happen? Especially why should it happen to Oromos on Oromo land? The Oromos didn't go elsewhere. Addis Ababa came to them. But again, this is across the country, right? Because the garrison towns are almost everywhere, especially in the conquered territories. And the relationship that was established there necessarily creates this very toxic relationship between peoples. And I think part of the problem in Ethiopia is, as we're trying to navigate this shift, naturally, historically marginalized people want this unequal relationship to change. They want to also feel at home in their lands. But how do we talk about the systemic institutions and the systemic structures that maintain that inequality and that maintain this horrible alienation? And I think 1991 presented a really excellent opportunity. However, we know how the TPLF completely, undermined that. And also, I think one thing we don't talk about enough is post-1991, the narrative that was propagated by the TPLF is not so much unlike what Abiy Ahmed is doing now to Tagaru people, because the TPLF also had this narrative that Amhara people are the problem rather than the system being the problem. And Abiy Ahmed is similarly now saying, if we could just get rid of TPLF, and it's often employed by various people on social media as if we can just get rid of the Tagaru, who are the ones who put in place this system. And also there's not recognition that this is a system that historically marginalized people fought for. It wasn't a system that TPLF gave to them as a favor. And there's often this kind of neglect of that. And people think the reason why people were cheering this war, Addis Ababa specifically, is because they think that the only thing standing between them and a new post-ethnic Ethiopia, which is really the most ethnicized Ethiopia, is the dismantlement of the TPLF as an entity. So, you know, I have a lot to say about Addis Ababans, but I'm gonna leave it there.
And just to add to both of you, this is amazing. I hope for anyone who ends up watching this who's not Ethiopian, you're learning a lot about the sort of the deep intricacies of what's going on. And as I've been saying over the last 4 weeks, this is a multi-layered conflict. I think like part of the issue is like Western journalists, because you know you have to fill a 500-word column. It's like, oh, you know, Abiy came to power, relations with Eritrea normalized, Tigray refused to go along with the federal delay of elections, held an election, and then a war happened. Like I feel like that's like the simplified narrative. And I understand you have to just dumb it down for your average sort of reader who's not going to care about the details. So a few things. One is, to Ayantu's point, the land history of Addis Ababa. This is precisely why the hashtag Oromo protests movement began. I mean, and I was warning against this. There was a panel discussion at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University that I was part of in 2014, where I was warning against the master plan, the Addis Ababa master plan process, which wasn't an inclusive process. There was no due process, and really just amounted to a land grab and forced evictions of Oromo, especially Oromo farmers and peasants in the periphery, which sort of again is a continuation of previous evictions and displacements. No actual compensation, again, no due process, and that just fueled the resentment. And so what we saw in 2014, 2015 really did result in Abiy Ahmed coming to power. And so, and again, a lot of that has to go back to the very sensitive status of Addis Ababa for Oromos. And so I think it's important that we just recognize that. And, you know, we may not fully understand what that anger looks like or what it feels like, but I think it's important just to try to understand it and recognize that the pain just exists there. You know, as a Tigrayan, I don't fully get it. You know, I can sympathize, but I may not be able to fully empathize with it. But it's important that we get there. A few things. So, you know, in Ethiopian history, oftentimes, you know, we talk about oppressors and oppressed, and I just want to recognize that, you know, all of us at one point were oppressors, and all of us at one point were oppressed, and it's just, you know, sometimes it's very easy to like, you know, assign like straight blame. I mean, even as Tigrayans, you know, you go back to sort of, you know, the era of the monarchy, and I mean, you saw sort of the brute force of the emperors, including Johannes IV and Tewodros II and others who sort of, you know, rebuilt sort of the modern Ethiopian state along with Emperor Menelik after the era of the princes. But even with the era of the princes, there were some pretty crazy regional warlords, basically feudal warlords from all ethnic backgrounds who committed what charitably could be described as war crimes today. You know, the whole constitution, I think it was a damn shame that the OLF was kicked out of the transitional federal government. Obviously, there was a lot of power grabbing and power maneuvers in the background, and it's unfortunate that the transitional federal government, 1991 to 1995, did not include the OLF. And I agree with Ayantu that you know, the sort of demonization that every Oromo was an OLF member and every Oromo was a terrorist and a secessionist. That was the narrative under the EPRDF. And it fueled hatred and suspicion for everything and anything Oromo. And so while yes, on paper, especially with Article 39, that, Oromo culture, language, history, whatever, may have been, guaranteed under the Constitution. In reality, the discrimination iota that you're talking about, that's something that I've observed and that many of my friends have also observed. Just even certain names that may not be sort of northern sounding or whatever, have been people have been discriminated. People have lost jobs because of that, or haven't even been granted an interview or whatever. So that's something that we need to recognize. The term ethnic federalism doesn't appear in the Ethiopian constitution, actually. It's nations, nationalities, and peoples. And so, and while they are all guaranteed equal status, we've seen obviously that's not truly the case with Ethiopia's federalism. I think that the constitution did a remarkable job in sort of coming up with a real imperfect system, but it was something that I think was needed to keep the country intact. This isn't to say that what was true in 1995 is true today. I think this is to say, and I've said this again for the last 4 weeks, Ethiopia has not had a constitutional convention since ratifying its constitution. There's never been an actual popular discussion as to sort of where is the country now and where should it be going. And so this is, Maso, maybe you could talk more about this as a lawyer, but I was hoping that we would see this, that Ethiopia would get to this point of saying, okay, we're in a crossroads. 2018, we're in a crossroads. Let's think about some of the deep structural reforms that we need to undertake before we start doing other things, right? I think what Avi started doing was things that were nice, sort of liberalizing the economy, whatever, but without the sort of basic structural reforms. It's sort of a house that's being built without a solid foundation, and so I saw that as really concerning. Avi, his reforms, it was like a car that was going at 100 miles per hour without a proper brake system or whatever. So I think that was really concerning for me. And then just very lastly, Ethiopia has never had a real truth and reconciliation process. And so, 1991, people were demonized and others were demonized. And we've seen that again in 2018. And I just hope that we, and right now there's a real question as to sort of how is the country going to, rehabilitate from this war. And I'm not entirely sure what the steps are, but whatever it is, it needs to involve a national political dialogue with all armed groups and all political groups, but it also needs to involve a real deliberate truth and reconciliation process where people can air out their grievances, but really find ways to move forward. And then very lastly, last two things. One is, and I had written about this years ago about the EPRDF, was, I think that there has to be sort of a happy medium, to your point, Maswa. I don't think that celebrating, embracing your ethnicity, your nationality should not be an issue in Ethiopia. I think we need to recognize Ethiopia for what it is. It is a collection of distinct nationalities. It's a collection of distinct kingdoms and principalities that had been merged into a modern polity, a modern state. So I don't think that's a bad thing. But one thing that I had hoped for was more political parties in Ethiopia would find ways to bridge sort of a common narrative, a common understanding among people. For me, a lot of that comes down to the economy and finding ways to provide people with opportunities to grow. I mean, we saw this in Europe with a lot of European countries that are sort of multi-ethnic and multinational countries, for them coming together, and indeed the European Union coming together, it was about building economic opportunities and sort of creating a climate where people don't feel left out and where a particular identity may have the upper hand. And so that's something that was never really achieved in the sort of 30-year democratic project for Ethiopia, and that's something that I think needs to be achieved. People feel excluded from the country's economic growth. No one's denying that Ethiopia has made some serious gains over the last 30 years, but the question is who has benefited from it. And so I think that that's been a real issue, and I would have loved to see the EPRDF sort of morph into that, or other political parties now morph into that, where there's a common understanding, because one question that I've actually struggled to answer over the last few months is what actually binds Ethiopians together? Because the Ethiopian narrative that we know benefits people like me. You know, I'm Tigrayan, I'm a Highlander, I'm Abyssinian, I'm Orthodox Christian. You know, the narrative of, you know, the Queen of Sheba and all of that, like that benefits me because that's my direct history. It's what I'm comfortable with, but I know that that doesn't represent all of Ethiopia. Indeed, only 40% of Ethiopians actually speak Amharic. So, you know, I think that there needs to be a conversation as to sort of what does it mean to be Ethiopian? And that's something that I don't think that the EPRDF actually ever defined. You know, you look at China, and through centuries, you know, sort of most Chinese people now identify as Han, as the Han ethnic group, over 90% do, but that's not true. But through brute force, people have become to sort of be accustomed as Han Mandarin speakers. So because that was attempted throughout Ethiopian history and is not the case, there is no singular Ethiopian identity. I think it's just important to sort of figure out what is it that binds Ethiopians? What is it that makes a nation or nationality want to be part of the Ethiopian Federation, and that they don't invoke the secession clause? I don't know if we've actually answered that. And so my hope is that in the coming years, Ethiopian political leaders and the Ethiopian population as a whole can sort of figure out what does it mean to actually be Ethiopian.
Oh, sorry. I just want to jump in really quick too on something that Ayantu mentioned that I found really interesting, is like that this sentiment of people in Ethiopia supporting this war because they believe like basically you get rid of the TPLF or you get rid of the Tagadu and you don't have to deal with this multi-ethnic federalism, right? Because they're at the root of the problem. I just find it really interesting. Something that I'm learning is that's like the same idea for like pro-government Eritreans, like the very, very irrational thinking pro-government Eritreans who support the dictator and who buy into this rhetoric of like the reason why Eritrea doesn't have like a university, the reason why, you know, we can't focus on a constitution or we can't focus on anything is because of Wayane and like everything that they're trying to do to destabilize Eritrea. That's been his main like rhetoric. So those people are supporting this war for the very same reason, which I just find pretty interesting, you know, because at the end of the day, this war is not going to benefit any of us, you know, and I think sensible people can understand that. But yeah, I just wanted to point out that that fact.
Yeah, it's super interesting for those folks because, and just, you know, the PFDJ regime in general, because as long as you're willing to just externalize blame when it comes to any issues that are going on in a country or in any unit, to be honest, right? Like that sort of process that exists, it's not about the object to which you're externalizing that blame, right? It's not about like whoever you're directing, like, oh, these are the cause of our problems, this boogeyman, whoever or whatever it may be. It's about, right, the internal issues that you're not willing to deal with and not capable of dealing with. And so I think in the Eritrean context, it's just interesting to see over, even during liberation time, like the ways in which sort of like the problems that exist within, whether it be EPLF or within the PFDJ, like there's always just going to be some other boogeyman. And so like TPLF no longer exists, right? Who's going to be the new boogeyman? Who's going to be the organization or the institution or the direct object of the blame of the Eritrean regime to get people off of really like the real issues that Eritreans have? And that's why, you know, if y'all were on Twitter today and you saw the tweet about, you know, the strategic depopulation of Eritrea is the blame of the UNHCR. Yamane Meskel was saying this. So it's like, wait, the UNHCR is what's causing Eritrean refugees out of the country, right? 5,000 people a month for all the years that Mark was saying is because the UNHCR. Now that's an interesting boogeyman to choose, but it's like, it doesn't matter who or what it is, there's always going to be a new one. And so it's we got to be mindful of that, and we have to be able to really just like point that out and call out the problems and obstacles as they are, as you just did, Mark, right? Like it's the ruling party, right? The ruling regime.
You guys answered my next question. It was actually just an organic transition, but I just want to highlight if there's another perspective that you have in regards to the previous regime versus the New Prosperity Party. If you are able to identify if there's anything that was better or worse under the previous regime, whether it be economically or just ethnic tension. If you have that thought, please share. If not, I'll move on to the next question.
I can jump in, Maki, on this. So I guess just answering one question that I think Andron raised also in the beginning, sort of the international influence that that is sort of an undercurrent. I mean, always, but in the Ethiopian and the Horn context. So I think I don't like comparing, post 2018 with the past to say, one is better than the other, because I think that's always been our problem back in Ethiopia, or I think generally in the Horn, or even generally, I should say, society, just, sometimes those who are in power want to use sort of the bad elements of the previous regime and say this element's better. And I think that's just going to keep us. And I think EPRDF used to do that. Like Ethiopia is like an oasis, like it's the most stable country in the Horn, they used to say, because every other country seemed, in trouble. And I always rejected that, because we're not comparing ourselves with, other states that are struggling. I mean, that shouldn't be an aspiration of the people. In the same way, so I don't compare it with, I reject, PP cadres now who want to say, this is better, there are less journalists in prison and all of this. But I think in one aspect, in terms of like the influence of international actors in our politics, it's a very important issue that we touched on in the beginning, but we didn't quite, address it beyond Isaias and Eritrea and Ethiopia. We didn't talk about the UAE and potentially the US and Egypt and, Israel, and this sort of geopolitics that's shaping, that's rearranging alliances in that region. So for me, I think that's a huge part of the story. We don't have, obviously, because our governments are so not transparent and don't give us information as they should. They don't, so we don't know, we don't have documents we download and say, they signed this or that, but we know it's happening. And I think the people are not ready to confront the nuances of those things and how the war is being fought in somewhat of a proxy, form. So there's that. And I think having said that, the economic liberalization that's going on parallel, that was going on in the past 3 years is also a really big element of this, because the reason why Prime Minister Abiy got a lot of, international attention, in addition to the peace, peace agreement with Eritrea, is because he promised to open the country up for international investors, liberalize sectors that were completely shut off for international competition for decades, for a good reason, in my opinion. And basically just promised that Ethiopia will be the next frontier, for competition. And it's a huge market. Everyone, even when Meles was closing doors at the time, even then, people were excited about what market Ethiopia offers. So then I've been looking at this closely as an academic project in terms of what was happening in the economic liberalization sphere. And my concern when I was looking at and tracking what's going on is that it would derail the democratic project. So, Abiy promised he would liberalize both the politics and the economy. And he promised to do that at the same time. And whenever you're doing such drastic transformation at the same time, it's gonna create clashes, and whatever you're doing in the economy is going to influence what happens in the political sphere. So I was concerned from my sort of analysis early on that it would derail the political liberalization for various theoretical, I used a few country examples to kind of highlight that problem. Now we don't have to worry about that hypothesis because the democratic project, it seems to me, is kind of is no longer alive. But I think it was what was happening is that because he got a lot of the attention and the support, financial and otherwise, to do what he wanted in exchange for, in some ways, promising these major reforms that may not necessarily align with the interest of the people. So let me give you an example. The Oromo protest we talked about as being the main sort of driver that sort of stimulated the popular protest and that led to the change. Sam earlier mentioned about the Addis Ababa master plan. Yes, it has the historical and other elements, but it's also about access to resources. It's about land, it's about jobs, it's about making sure that the investors that are setting shop in Oromia are creating the types of opportunities that youth want to benefit from because it's their country. So there were those demands. And then there's also just massive unemployment. There's questions about labor rights all over the country. I mean, I think right before the 2018 change, like we've seen massive strikes that, you know, we didn't see in the country since the time of those like labor rights movement. So like we are seeing all of these democratic demands that people were making that led to the change in 2018. And then we were witnessing economic reforms that would probably run into sort of the same, that would clash with those demands. So neoliberalism and as a whole, sort of as a project, would derail the democratic project. And I was sure almost from how things were going that was the compromise that the government would be willing to make, that would prioritize the economic liberalization and sort of do what as they should. Now things are being complicated, as we were saying, because if the country is unstable, nobody wants to come and invest in the country. So yeah, that I think we need to sort of touch on a little bit to see like beyond what the actors are doing to influence the security and sort of the war. There's also just a huge economic intervention that's going to affect how people are going to organize politically, and some people are going to lose and others are going to gain. So
if I can jump on that, a few things that just stick out to me. I agree with everything that Massoud said. So, interestingly, so when you sort of look at the previous government and the current government, one thing that I think really stood out for a lot of countries, including the United States, and we actually learned a lot through the leaks, through WikiLeaks of the diplomatic cables. The United States, was always sort of frustrated with the EPRDF, but what they saw to be true, and I think a lot of people sort of objectively could see this, is Meles in particular, but the EPRDF as a government, for them, they used to negotiate. Their foreign policy was really about negotiating what they saw was Ethiopia's interests, as opposed to caving into what they felt was pressures from the US or others. And so we saw this in many instances where, if the United States, for instance, had something to say to Ethiopia about human rights or whatever, the US and the EU actually had more success with Ethiopia raising those issues behind closed doors than in public. So for instance, after the 2005 election, the Dudley riots, the arrest of political leaders and protesters and others, I don't think that without the intervention of the United States, really behind closed doors, I don't know that the government would have pardoned the opposition leaders. I don't know if that would have been a thing. I think that there was a lot of back channeling going on in addition to popular protests, but I think that the actual government clampdown would have probably been worse, in my opinion. And that's sort of what I had always sort of believed in. I think after the WikiLeaks cables came out, I think we saw a lot of that being confirmed, that at least on the US side, they saw it as don't criticize these people publicly, because when you do, they just clamp down further. Whereas if you try to mediate behind closed doors, we saw that the PRDF relatively softened up a little bit. And so I think that that's interesting. But yeah, I mean, the Ethiopian government has always sort of, even under previous governments, has always sort of negotiated from what it believed was its national interest. There's a question as to, whether that's true today. I don't know if that's entirely true today. I'm really concerned about the liberalization, not because the markets are opening up, but because I think things are just happening too quickly. As I said earlier, I think, when you are reforming too quickly and you're not really measuring against consequences, and you're not really doing things in a deliberative way, which I don't think that Ethiopia's government under Abiy Ahmed is doing, things will begin to crack, and we're seeing this now. And so, and I was concerned. I mean, like for a while there was, we're going to sell off Ethiopian Airlines, and then there was like a backlash, and then they said, well, no, we're not going to actually do that, but maybe we'll look at some parts of the Ethiopian Airlines group, right? The actual the sort of holding company. Maybe there are parts of it that we can sell, and maybe reserve for local Ethiopians as opposed to international investors. And there's just been sort of a lot of flip-flopping and wishy-washiness in terms of what is Ethiopia actually doing. And I actually think for the first 6 to 9 months, I don't know if there was actually a coherent policy. And I mean, there sort of is now, but I don't really think that it's fully fleshed out. I'm concerned by the strong influence of the World Bank and the IMF in Ethiopia. These are institutions that historically, I mean, yes, I understand people keep saying, well, this is not your father's World Bank, or this is not your father's IMF, and I don't know what that means. These are institutions that have very clear track records of doing harm among the least developed countries around the world, and certainly they've done their fair share of harm in Africa. And I don't necessarily think that China's the answer too, because China has provided billions of dollars of loans to Ethiopia and Africa, but a lot of it comes with high interest rates, and it's unsustainable borrowing at the end. And so there's got to be an Ethiopian solution to what's going on. But I think that reforming too quickly, doing anything too quickly, and not really pulling these levers in moderation, we're seeing right now where just the whole reform project is blowing up in front of us. And I've been telling people Ethiopia is like it's like your house burning on fire, and the fire department's actually adding to the fire instead of extinguishing it. And so I think that's an issue. And then just the last thing is, I do agree that it wasn't just the reproach with Eritrea, but also the liberalization that actually got Abiy a Nobel Prize and all of that. I think, the West, the problem, I think, especially for the United States is, we in the US were always looking for a hero. This happened in the 1990s, where the sort of the new breed of leaders, right? Isaias and Meles and Museveni and others were sort of hailed as this new generation, the change makers. They were all young and whatnot. And I will argue this point that I think that there were some serious improvements made under the EPRDF. I do believe that to be true. But ultimately, I think the problem with how we do foreign policy in the United States is we're always looking for a hero, and we're always trying to anoint someone as the great big hope, as the Messiah, as opposed to taking a step back, watching what's going on, and then sort of responding, right? The United States is not always going to be able to control what happens in another country, but the US can control how it responds to a country. And so I think that, and I've been saying this to members of Congress over the last few weeks, especially, is I think that a lot of them were just too quick, and the State Department and others, I think a lot of people were just too quick to bless Abiy, as opposed to say, let's see how he performs, and then we can sort of make a judgment call about that. But I think, part of that also had to do with the Ethiopian diaspora and just the immense pressure that was applied on Congress to respond to Ethiopia's human rights situation, and Congress just looking for some way to appease the diaspora, but also to sort of say that, we've accomplished something. And so I think that that's a real problem. They made Abiy very untouchable from the beginning. And we saw a lot of that in the 1990s with Prime Minister Meles and others as well, where they were given sainthood without proving if they were saints or not. And so I think that's a problem. And I hope that we as Americans can also influence the decision-making that happens in Washington to say, hey, look, like, you keep doing this and it keeps not working. Let's try to do something else.
I can quickly add a couple of things. I think that in terms of the, what was good, what was bad, previous regime versus current, which is really the same regime essentially. Since some of the same key people continue to be in power. I think that I just want to speak on that a little bit broadly, which is that Ethiopia's entire economic and political structure hinges on the continued economic and political subjugation of the Oromo and the vast majority of Ethiopians. So the question really is, can we move away from an exploitative economic and political model? And I do not see a desire to do that in the current government. And for me, if TPLF's governance in Ethiopia is anything to go by, the difference between Tigrayan and Amhara elite political thinking appears to be in how to dominate the Oromo and the South. This really seems, I do not think that TPLF is qualitatively all that different. I think it's about how do we exploit this vast group of people and this vast group of resources. And neither Tigrayan nor Amhara elites see the Oromo and other groups as equal citizens with whom to partner in the building of a better country. It's always as, of course, the TPLF chose the worst of the Oromo elites to govern that region, and it was a really horrendous almost 3 decades in the region. So I think there has to be, as I speak right now, the entire Oromo legitimate political class remains in prison for over 6 months. And Abiy Ahmed is preparing for an election. So when I say we're stuck in a cycle, we're really stuck on a cycle. So for me, all of these discussions about the economy are very important. However, if we don't acknowledge and don't realize that essentially nothing has changed for the Oromo, they were dominated against the TPLF, under the TPLF-led EPRDF government, and they're dominated now under Abiy Ahmed, even though they're the ones who fought for the change, not alone, but they were the ones who led that change that brought Abiy Ahmed to power. So there's a way in which the structural inequality continues to reproduce itself, and what's to be done about that? I think it's a question that Abiy Ahmed and his supporters are not even trying to deal with, because they feel they live in a whole other realm. But I think that this is going to be the central question in Ethiopia. How do we fundamentally renegotiate that relationship so that Ethiopian well-being is not predicated on destroying the Oromo and other marginalized groups?
I have to. Go ahead. I just want to jump on that quickly. Go ahead.
I guess I have a different view of what Ayantu just framed as a reference point in terms of the economy, because Ayantu, please help enlighten me on this, because I've heard this from other Oromo elites as well, the idea that sort of the main problem is that, the Tigrayan and Amhara elite sort of have as an operational manual the idea of the southern resources and southern people have to be subjugated. I think that the historical record, we can talk about that, the historical, what happened in terms of the expansion of the empire and the conquest, but in the past 50 years, I would push back a bit on that and at least ask for where I can learn more about that, because I feel like the poor people in Tigray, the farmers in Amhara, which is the majority of the Amhara and the Tigray. I mean, because the elites are just, we can count them in thousands, right? The rest are subjugated similarly, are as, poverty-stricken as the Oromo or the Kambata or the Somali. The way I think about structural differences is, we don't have a lot of data on, how our people differ across ethnicities, right? But at least we have poverty level data on, how many, across the 10 Khalils, right? And we would see access to schools, access to medical services, and all of these things. We have basic statistics on that, both government generated and other international partners generated, right? And you would see, for example, stark differences in Afar and Somali. You would see access to primary education being 20% or 30%. It's incredible, right? Whereas when you compare it to, say, Amhara or Oromo, you might find 70 or almost 100% primary education now. So when I have that clearly pointed to me, I'm like, how is it fair to see or Somali Ethiopians have 20% chance of accessing a primary school or healthcare center, whereas Amhara or Oromo or Tigray. So those types of analysis is how I understand how the economy and like wealth and resources are being distributed. When you look at resources, and then if we want to talk about proportional, right? Like, so if we look at the regions and say Oromo and Southern Ethiopia has more resources, land and good climate and all of these things, and then try to compare how did they benefit, how did the majority of the people benefit relative to what they have, and then compare to, you know, what the Tigrayans and Amhara poor people benefited. We may see differences there, but even that, I'm not convinced yet that there's a systematic like discrimination or subjugation of the poor in the southern parts of Ethiopia compared to, you know, bad climate, poor parts of the north as well. So I just want to get a bit more help from you and others, because I think it's fundamental, because if we understand the country's problem in this way, then we're excusing a large majority of the Oromo elite who have been exploiting Oromos for the past 30 years, and the large majority of the southern elites who have been exploiting their own people. And I feel like Ethiopians across the board have been, you know, under this oppressive system of exploitation. And the question is, how can we undo it? How can we give the people power to shape the economic policies and the political systems that would govern them, right? So basically, how do we know, like, that the southern or the Oromo people, the poor people, I guess, disenfranchised economically, are disproportionately affected than the Tigrayans and Amharas? So sorry, it's a big question. I know it's not a good time to.
Okay, yeah. Okay, just quickly, first of all, if I appear to be saying that only Amhara and Tigray elites are exploitative, I am not. I think that historically, the way that power has been distributed in that country, it has been, you know, especially since post-19th century Ethiopian empire. I don't know if you all accept this. For me, I feel like this is the first time that we're all under the same authority. Prior to the 19th century, there were multiple sovereignties and sovereign peoples. To some people, this is not acceptable, but I mean, it's crazy. You didn't need conquest if we didn't have, you know, independent groups. But however, I think there's this pattern, right? When Menelik is expanding south, he's using subjects of groups he's already conquered to dominate these areas. And so this creates a pattern of governance. I mean, during Haile Selassie's era, a lot of the Balabats were Oromo, they were Southerners, but like this relationship that was created between them and the local population was one of exploitation. At that point, there's this class now that's created between ordinary Oromo people and also these new elites whose power derives not from the people, but from their association with the ultimate authority sitting in Addis Ababa. So there is that. I think that this class of Oromo elites, I've written about this class of Oromo elites that have been created through this system are very anti-democratic. In Oromia, for instance, they're the ones who are responsible for imprisonment, for torture. They were doing this work at the in this relationship that they had with the TPLF, and of course, it was an unequal relationship that they negotiate with the TPLF. However, this group of people are essentially part of the problem for me. And I just want to make that clear. The second thing is this issue of poverty. There's this weird way in which we conflate issues of poverty with issues of autonomy and democracy and sovereignty and local governance. Yes, all of Ethiopia's people are majority poor. And I have no interest in comparing how poor are the Amhara peasants versus how poor are the Oromo peasants, because it's not the Amhara peasants who are coming south and conquering and subjugating the Oromo peasants, right? So it's like, how do we think about this system structurally from the different layers that are involved? Yes, there's the issue of inequality in education, inequality in resources that you mentioned, Mastish, and I don't think that looking at that layer of it entails having to ignore this larger historical systemic way in which relationships have been negotiated between who's in power and who's governed. So I think the answer, I don't want to purport to have an answer to this very complex question, but I think part of the solution for me is local democracy, where people actually get to select who will make decisions on their behalf, rather than whoever is in Addis Ababa will then, be the one in charge in the regions. The other thing, there's often also a way in which, and I think there's a failure in the Oromo discourse not to account for what is the importance of ethnicity, what's ethnicity's intersection with class, for instance. And I think this is part of why this movement could be hijacked by someone like Abiy Ahmed, because these harder questions about, yes, Abiy Ahmed claims to be an Oromo, but did Oromo youth die to bring to power an Oromo prime minister? No, essentially their questions were very systemic. Their questions were about addressing both contemporary and historic challenges. And for that, yeah, I will admit that I feel like the Oromo discourse has not done a good job of articulating where the national oppression is and where the class and economic oppression is.
I think you both are saying some phenomenal things. I'm taking some notes down and just, wanted to very briefly respond to a few things. I agree about, the notion of a power imbalance and the lack of localized control, and how that has bred real grievances. It's interesting. I sort of almost am reminded of the imperial era, where the center would send viceroys to different regions to govern them, and that is what happened over the last 30 years, where while on paper Ethiopia was a federation, the reality was that everything went through the prime minister's office. And more importantly, everything went through the party. The party apparatus, the EPRDF apparatus, actually mattered more than the government apparatus. It was more organized, it was more tight-knit, it was more effective actually, and largely more efficient than this centuries-old bureaucratic system that really had sort of been launched under the sort of later emperors of Johannes and Menelik and Haile Selassie. And so, and this is actually why, like, a lot of political observers would have told you under the EPRDF that if you wanted to really understand Ethiopian politics, don't follow what parliament does, but follow the annual EPRDF Congress. Because when the EPRDF meets in their Gimgama sessions, that's when you actually learn what they're thinking, as opposed to what the rubber stamp parliament would say, because all those questions were pre-canned anyways. Anyway, and so, but yeah, I mean, to the point of like perpetuating the systemic inequalities, I think it is, to Massachusetts and Anna's point, like, I think it is a problem of elites, regardless of what their ethnicity is. The reality is Ethiopia is 85% rural. 60% of Ethiopians don't have access to electricity. There's only 15% internet penetration. Somalia, which has been in anarchy since 1991, has better internet penetration than Ethiopia, which is just blows my mind. And so, I think the reality is that poor is poor is poor, regardless of sort of where they are. And even sort of in the Tigrayan context, one of my biggest issues with the TPLF was always that they really had sort of assumed Tigrayan support in many ways over the last 30 decades. There was sort of this, don't forget what we did for you type of like Stockholm syndrome type, where, and I, if I can say, I see it in Eritrea as well with Isaias, where it's like, hey, like, I'm the one that liberated you, like, don't question me. And it's like, well, great, like, thank you for unseating Mengistu and, whatever, and thank you for some of the infrastructural gains and whatnot, but what's next? Like, can we be more forward-looking than sort of a continuous relitigation of the past? And I'd seen that, I mean, in the United States, this is one of the grievances that I have as a proud Democrat. This is one of the grievances I have with the Democratic Party, where the Democrats assume the support of Black people without actually providing any concrete agenda as to why they're better than, I mean, we know you're not openly racist like Republicans are, but like, what else? So, and again, I'm not comparing the political context of both countries. I'm saying it in the sense of the assumption of support. and the sort of otherization of if it's not us, then this group, whoever the other is going to eat you alive or whatever. And so I think that's been an issue. I agree with Ayantu. I think the Oromo elites are incredibly problematic, but that has been the case for a lot of the ethnic elites and true throughout Ethiopian history. Again, sort of when you are centering power in the center, when you are drawing authority from one source, you are going to sort of be more loyal to the source than your own people. And so we've seen that in Ethiopian history, and this power imbalance. I think part of the reason why part of the reason why I think some of the things over the last 2-3 decades have worked well was just sort of this emphasis on infrastructure development and whatnot. I think when people have basic infrastructure, because I think we can't forget also that housing, shelter, medicine, these things are basic human rights as well. It's not just political freedoms. So I think really intently focusing on that and focusing on poor rural Ethiopians is going to be sort of the way to move forward. And this is actually one of, and I'll stop after this because I could go on this, but one of the biggest criticisms I've had with Abiy is sort of this insane focus on vanity projects, like billions of US dollars that are being raised and spent on public parks in Addis Ababa for God knows what reason, and millions of dollars that has been spent on upgrading government offices. Literally, I mean, the prime minister comes in and within the first few months is dropping money. Some say it was funded by the UAE. I'm not entirely sure, to do a complete makeover of the prime minister's office. It looks like a sterilized clinic, basically, all white walls and just just weird. But anyway, and some of these government offices, they look fancier than hotels even. And so it's just, misplaced priorities where, yeah, I understand you do need to beautify. I mean, Addis is the capital of Africa. How it appears is important. I'm not going to deny that. But I think when you are creating an order of precedence in terms of priorities, most Ethiopians are in the middle of nowhere. And if you're not investing in them, you are actually perpetuating their economic and political subjugation. And so that really did annoy me, this overemphasis of tree planting and overemphasis of building parks and creating documentaries to show off all the imperial era cars. Like, no one cares about that. Like if Ethiopians can't eat 3 times a day, and to his credit, when Meles came in 1991, he was asked by diplomats and journalists sort of like, what is your goal here? And he did say that he wanted Ethiopians to eat 3 times a day, and that he would sort of measure his success based off of that. Obviously, there's much to be said there, and there still are Ethiopians who are not eating 3 times a day. But I really do think that is still a standard that we need to hold Ethiopian elites and Ethiopian officials to. Unless Ethiopians are eating 3 times a day, unless they have clean water, access to electricity, access to basic services, and things that we just take for granted here in the United States, then what are we really talking about when we talk about freedoms? Because economic freedoms and infrastructure is as important as free speech and free freedom of the press. And I would argue that that's probably true also for Eritrea. I'd love to hear our Eritrean brothers chime in on that as well.
No, I mean, that was so informative. It was great to listen to. Just very, very quickly, I'll say in Eritrea, besides obviously everything with the regime, from an economic perspective, I think of it in terms of 3 W's: water, waste, and Wi-Fi. Like those 3 things, obviously food as well. So if you come up with a good W for food, but those 3 things are just like, you're speaking about the lack of internet penetration throughout Ethiopia. I mean, Eritrea has the world's worst internet in the entire world, right? The worst internet in the entire world. You can't get Wi-Fi at all. I've had some interesting encounters with people in Niala Hotel, where you go there at 6 a.m. before anyone has gone to the hotel to get onto the Wi-Fi, because once there's more than 3 people, it's going to take you, 3 hours to scroll through one Instagram post. But yeah, so water, waste, and Wi-Fi for me.
Yeah, I was just I was just happy to be able to listen to you guys answer that question. That was really more so, I think, for the Ethiopian perspective. You know what I mean? Nothing has changed under either regime for us, right? We still got dictators has fun either way we look at it. Yeah, and I have one quick question. I know we gotta kind of get close to wrapping up. We got a couple more questions we want to dive into, so I hope this doesn't open up a whole can of worms. But for Ayatu, I was just wondering, like, the level of violence that we've seen targeted towards the Oromo people, like months before this war started. Do you feel like there was that similar level? Like you talked about this, there was the same level of dominance of Oromo land and Oromo rights under each regime, but was there that level of violence that there is now under Abiy, or not?
This is a difficult question. I think that there was a time during the EPRDF era when Oromos literally could not like really gather in like a small group of like more than 5 people. Like their daily lives were very much policed and militarized, and so militarization has always been part of life, and also like violence as governance. It's like it's as ordinary as, you know, it's a very, very strong component of how Oromo territories are governed. I think that the swiftness with which Abiy Ahmed's government has gone after Oromo protesters and anybody seen as even potentially, not just like literal opponents, but potential opponents have been killed, have been jailed. Western Oromia has basically been blockaded for over a year now, and there hasn't been internet. So yeah, I mean, I feel like it's very hard for me to say one was better or worse, or, you know, but I think that the intensity of the violence is probably as bad or worse than some of the worst EPRDF years. When my friends I can always tell by how bad things are by like how much people are willing to talk over the phone, like, and what they'll say. And my father returned from Ethiopia and he brought back really horrible stories. But basically, Oromia is, as default, now a militarized zone. People are afraid to even visit their relatives in jail. The mass level of incarceration we saw this summer, an Oromo artist was killed. He was much beloved, and that was used as a pretext to imprison thousands of people. So we're talking upwards of 20,000 people, and I'm being conservative with that figure. And we had schools converted into jails. So I mean, but the thing is, I really don't want to exceptionalize the violence against the Oromo, because what makes the Oromo different is where they're at geographically within the Ethiopian state. They're at the center. The state's focus is often on them as a problem. So there's that way in which violence targets the Oromo specifically, but the Ethiopian state has always been violent, like exceptionally violent to all of its people. I mean, like we've had genocide in the Ogaden. There's just been like so much violence, and recently all the violence we've seen in Oromia, in Benishangul Gumuz against Amharas and other ethnic communities remain unaddressed. And each time there was a violence, the government weaponized it to go after its opponent, whether it was Ola or, you know, whoever at the moment needed to be put down. So yeah, things are really bad in Oromia. So it's, yeah. I guess the one thing that makes it worse, that potentially makes it worse, is that under EPRDF, with the establishment of the multinational federal system, which the Oromo fought for, people felt like at least they gained something, which was for the first time, people can go to school using their native languages. And there was this legal recognition that a people named Oromo exist, which had been stripped from them through the conquest. Now it appears that we're moving backwards. So potentially this regime could be worse or is worse. I'm trying to be very conservative about this because I think not all the Oromo, especially of the elite kind, see yet what they're doing. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Just to very quickly chime on to add on to that, I think so. Starting on the Oromo elite part, I think part of that, and this is not unique to Oromo elites. I think this is unique. This is a very characteristic of all the elites in Ethiopia. Is that, and the reason why I keep saying that Prosperity Party PP in many ways is EPRDF 2.0 is because you have these elites of different ethnicities who are sycophants, and they will sort of go with the wind, whichever way the wind blows, right? So if the wind for nearly 3 decades was the TPLF, so that's sort of where you go, and it's so, I mean, I think it's rich that some of the people who are on these news articles that are in these news articles and news video segments and whatnot, talking about the sort of criminal clique, this junta that exists. It's not junta, it's junta, but no government official apparently knows how to pronounce that. Is just it's rich that these are the people who perpetrated serious atrocities. I mean, anything that the TPLF is guilty of, then starting with Abiy Ahmed himself, was the co-founder and director general of the Information Network Security Agency, Ethiopia's cyber intelligence agency. Ethiopia has 3 main security chiefs: the head of cyber intelligence, the head of the National Intelligence and Security Service, NIS, and then the head of the federal police. These are sort of the 3 core security chiefs. In 2018, we actually saw the United States placed global Magnitsky sanctions on Getachew Assefa, who is a Tigrayan and was the head of NIS, the Director General of NIS. I mean, this guy is so seclusive. There is no photo. There is like literally no verified photo of Getachew Assefa. No one knows what he looks like. But this guy was sort of at the head of the security apparatus, at the helm of it. Workene, the head of federal police, is now roaming freely as the executive secretary of IGAD. And he was most recently Ethiopia's foreign minister, or I guess 2 foreign ministers ago. Ethiopia has gone through 3 foreign ministers in 2 years. And then Abiy, who was head of cyber intelligence, who was the guy responsible for bugging everyone's phone and bugging everyone's internet and repression and shutting off telecoms and all that stuff, somehow remade himself as a saint. And so and really, I mean, all these people, including Redwan Hussein and others, are the problem. And so if you're going to really talk about justice and sort of moral authority, even Haile Mariam Desalegn in his article in Foreign Policy a little over a week ago, I thought was really rich. I mean, he was chairman of the EPRDF and prime minister of Ethiopia, numerous states of emergency under him. I mean, the Oromo protest movement began under him. We saw how he and his government responded to those protests over 4 years. I mean, give me a break here. Like, no one has moral superiority in Ethiopia. That's a joke. I mean, and the West knows that too. I mean, so it's like, I don't know who you're trying to convince here, but I think sometimes Ethiopians try so hard to like convince each other of who's evil, and it's like look, there's a structural problem here. Everyone is to blame in many respects. And I would just say in closing that I think I actually think that Abiy is worse than the EPRDF for especially the TPLF for Oromos, just because the one thing that the TPLF and the OLF and really sort of most Ethiopians really did agree on was the necessity of a multinational federation to keep the country intact. The problem was that that was never actually materialized. Again, all power remained in the prime minister's office, although on paper, and yeah, I mean, you can ask some of the more veteran Oromo politicians, Bulcha Demeksa and Marara Gudina and others, will tell you that too. At least they agreed in principle of what needed to be done, the implementation of which didn't fully happen. But this particular government wants to sort of, I like how we're using the term "make Ethiopia great again" now, and it's really sort of this reversal of the politics of the past, which did not work, and it led us to 1974 and it led us to 1991. So why are we trying to go back to that as opposed to try to move forward and stop relitigating the past, but find a way that's equitable? And I don't think any of these actors actually reflect the future of Ethiopia in terms of the inclusivity that's needed to keep this country together. And the longer we delay this, the more likely it is that the country is going to fragment, and that will be a Pandora's box that leads to even greater instability. And just the very last thing, I think, because Abiy is part Oromo, the narrative over the last 2 years has been, oh, the Oromos have political power now, so everything must be okay. And now it's just these disgruntled youth who just don't know how to shut up. Like that's part of the narrative where it's like, no, I mean, you got your guy in power now, like leave us alone. And that's not true. And as we know, you don't have to look like me to represent me. You don't have to look like me to govern me. You do need to share my values, though. You need to share my principles. And what we saw in 2018 was an Oromo prime minister who came in and everyone thought, the whole world was going to be great after that, when in reality, we all looked the other way in many ways, and we looked the other way this summer when what he did there is what he's trying to do now in Tigray. And so the only difference is that Tigray, between the Tigray Special Forces and TPLF's own militia, they have military might that Oromia did not have to resist Abiy's encroachments.
I think what a lot of people miss too is that, or what a lot of people may not understand is with Isaias Afwerki in Eritrea, when the fight for independence started in Eritrea, right? Jabha was the group that was fighting, ELF, right? And Isaias became part of ELF in 1966, 5 years after it had already started and was established. And ELF, when it started, was they had 5 different zones that it was operating out of, right? So generally it was like the Muslim and regional areas that kind of knew each other, I guess you could say, or came from a common community. They all kind of were working together in 5 different zones. And then there was like the Christian Highlanders over here, and they were kind of loosely associated to try to achieve independence for Eritrea. And the big thing that Isaias was trying to bring to the country was nationalism. Essentially, he was basically saying, like, forget your regional party, forget the fact your religious affiliation, and let's all work together for this common cause of bringing independence to Eritrea, because all of that is very divisive. To focus on those things is very divisive, and to care about that is going to only weaken us when we have this great enemy to fight, right? And so what I just wanted to make that really clear, because that is something that was a huge ideological battle going on back in the 1970s in Eritrea, and now we kind of see that happening right now in Ethiopia, and we see that Abiy and Isaias are basically, they're ideological brothers too in this nationalism idea, right? And I feel like for Eritrea, right, I think in a sense that really destabilized us in a way, because people did give into this nationalistic ideology, and those who spoke out against it were eliminated on the path to independence, right? They were killed off, they were arrested, they disappeared. And so like when Isaias has this very centralized power, we don't have any local power to kind of combat that today, right? Because of this very centralized power. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there before we got into the solution part, because I feel like that's important to maybe I don't know, be a part of the discussion.
I think that's so important that you brought that up. I know somebody's writing an article about this that should be coming out soon, but how this question of recognizing the plurality, because Eritrea too has modeled itself after this. We're all Eritreans, we don't have differences kind of model with Isaias in charge. And of course that serves Isaias best. But I think definitely that with Abiy, there's this now ideological affinity. But I think this question of ethnicity scares a lot of African elites, not just Abiy and Isaias, but the entire African political system. I want to say all, if not most, if not all African countries are products of colonial borders. There are multiple peoples and nations within them. The African elites decided to keep the colonial borders. However, those issues, this is how like tribal warfare became a theme in how Africa is talked about. But really, it's this like lasting tensions around the colonial borders themselves, and like, what does it mean to be a Nigerian? What does it mean to be a Ugandan? And it's kind of like with Ethiopia, because our history is slightly not unique, just different. We are facing these questions in very different ways. But I think this is a question for all African elites. But what I've noticed, African peoples rather, because I feel the elites are just well served by centralization of power at the presidential or prime minister's office. What I've noticed is that this question does really scare people. And that's why we have seen people like Mamdani, even Museveni came out and spoke against federalism, and he's like, we shouldn't include ethnicity in politics. Isaias's trolls are constantly now talking about how federalism is a bad and how we need to get rid of it, and how it, and so this is, I feel like on the positive side, if Ethiopia figures this out and continues as a state, because that's what happened in 1991. OLF wasn't going to be part of a unitary state. The Somalis weren't going to be part of a unitary state. And I think we've kind of lost the memory of how the multinational federal system has come about. It was really, it was actually like the OLF had a huge part in putting down the conditions for the kind of system that under which they would be willing to continue living in Ethiopia. So if we actually figure it out and there's a system with which all of us are happy to live in, it could be possible, not a model, but like it could be an example of Africans actually peacefully working out through these, through these colonial borders. Yeah.
And can I chip in a question because it relates to what you just said? So I think there's like a major misunderstanding of the camp that I belong to, or you think I belong to, which is that there's a rejection of federalism as a system. I think it would be crazy for anyone, and there are those people who suggest that, like a complete unitary system, we don't care about any decentralization and whatnot. But I think what type of federalism serves Ethiopia is sort of where the debate is. And I know people want to color ethnic federalism in really bad lens and say, it's just on ethnicity. It's not just on ethnicity. The country's constitution recognizes nations, nationalities, and peoples. We don't know what peoples mean. So there is some room for people to say, Addis Ababa as a people, or Jawa or Adama as a people could also be recognized as one. So even the current constitution, I think, could make room for the different ideological camps. But I think we are not talking to each other. That's why I think you just mentioned the way that the current constitution is being designed. Obviously, OLF got kicked out later on, but there was also the Ethiopianist camp that got basically sidelined. And they were like, two unitarians there cannot even be taken like seriously in a negotiation. So then what happened is they waited for 30 years now to launch a war in Tigray with the vision of eliminating ethnic federalism and creating a new constitution after excluding Jawar and all the other articulate people who probably would push against it. So like, I think the question is, what's the balance between the type of sort of representation that ethnic groups for various historical reasons want to claim, and then also individual rights cannot be sort of trumped by this sort of historical right approach, but not quite the right solution, at least in terms of how the constitution balances sovereignty. So like, it's the people don't have a say necessarily in the way that the constitution is envisioned. So, but what's happening, unfortunately, is like now a new constitution is going to be negotiated in the coming months, whereby the ethno-nationalists are going to be completely sidelined, or their puppets will be represented. And then we'll have another decade of like fighting over that new constitution, in which, sorry, I'm just, yeah.
If I can just throw in quickly there, two things. One, on the point of Eritrean nationalism and plurality, I agree with everything that Mark and Anju said. I think the only thing I think that is different on the Eritrean side, at least, is the sort of common denominator was this 32-year struggle for independence, and sort of like how that sort of brought people together from my perspective. But I think perhaps the common denominator among some folks now, obvious supporters and whatnot, is the sort of the hatred of TPLF and what it stands for. And so you're definitely right to draw sort of parallels there between both leaders. I think just very quickly on how to strengthen the federation, there are two things I just want to chime in here on. One is, again, just to go back to the economics of things, and I know like this sort of going back to what Andam said about infrastructure and what I said earlier, and then what Magda was, I think, going to ask is, I think if you find ways where people feel like they are that they are sharing in the country's wealth, that they are sharing in the economic development, and not being made to feel like a guest is going to be really important. I think the other thing too is like, sort of one of the drawbacks of Ethiopia's federalism is, if I'm not from your ethnicity and I am living in your region, sometimes I will feel like a guest in my own country. And so again, this goes back to my point, is like, what does it mean to be an Ethiopian? And how do we sort of articulate that in a way that everybody identifies that this is your citizenship, regardless of where you are geographically? I may be a Tigrayan who lives and does business in Oromia, but I may be living on the sort of ancestral homeland of the Oromos, but I should be made to feel as equal as a human being and as a citizen of Ethiopia as sort of somebody who is native born to Bishoftu or something, So I think like that needs to sort of be a conversation. And I'm just saying that as an example, but same thing for an Amhara who may be living in Aksum or something like that, to make them feel sort of equally represented. And so I don't think that the 1995 Constitution answered all these questions. It set a great foundation for it, but this is why I think subsequent constitutional conventions were needed to articulate this. And then just the second thing is, I think, a friend of mine had suggested this, and the more I think about it, the more I think it makes sense, is to your point, Master Sean, who are the peoples of Ethiopia? Because frankly, that was never really I still don't know. I mean, I know what the nations and nationalities are, I just don't know who the people are. I mean, aside from 110 million people, who are the peoples of Ethiopia? And part of it is, I think there should be more federal administrative zones in Ethiopia. I don't think that's a problem, actually. I think there should be more federal districts. A friend of mine suggested, and I think rightfully so, especially along sort of border areas of different regional states, creating more sort of special zones or whatever could be a way to sort of alleviate certain tensions. But then also, I would say, to decentralize economic growth, because right now, if I want to be successful in Ethiopia, I have to move to Addis Ababa, and that's sort of where I make it. But why not have a model where there are a lot of other countries where, there are multiple commercial capitals, and there are multiple, I mean, if you want to be, like here in the United States, if you want to go sort of in the arts, you go to Los Angeles, you go to Hollywood. If you want to go into finance, maybe you look at New York, or if you want to go into software, you go to Silicon Valley. If you want to go to life sciences, you come to me, you come to Massachusetts, and you thrive here. If you, whatever, so et cetera. And so I think, so we don't have that in Ethiopia, where there are sort of multiple economic and commercial centers, where there are zones. I mean, I think the industrial parks tried to sort of envision that, and I applaud the work around the industrial parks. I think Ethiopia needs more sort of special economic zones where where not only foreign companies, but also local companies can thrive and compete in sort of an equitable and inclusive way. But in addition to that, thinking about multiple commercial centers where, again, like, you know, if I want to make it in Ethiopia's robotics industry or whatever, I need to move to Adama. Like, that's where I need to be. Or like, if I want to, you know, like Awassa, there's a lot of vineyards there. There's a lot of wineries in Awassa. So if I want to sort of make it in Ethiopia's growing wine and beer sector, then maybe I need to go to Awassa, and that's where I make it, right? Or if I want to go into engineering, maybe Meghalaya is the place to go. So I think having those types of conversations and seeing it where, like what you saw with post-World War II Europe was European countries started putting their money in each other. They started investing in each other. I'm not going to go to war with you if my money's in your pocket and your money's in my pocket. We're going to sort of collaborate because there's a sense of mutually assured destruction. And I'm not going to want to secede either, because if I secede, then I am losing from that, right? If Tigray secedes or if Oromia secedes, even if it's guaranteed in the constitution, you want to discourage it because you would be losing out, not just financially, but politically, militarily, whatnot, from losing out as being a member of this federation. So there isn't a clear-cut way, but those are just some ideas come to mind.
I just quickly want to respond to Mastish. I'll take this 1 minute. And also Sam. I think definitely Mastish, like we're seeing the reemergence of the zero-sum game, right? It's really actually terrible to watch this, especially if like you read, you know, especially if you're looking at the archives and seeing how the 90s played out, and you're like, it's playing out the same way again. And so that's, it's a train wreck. And unfortunately, I don't think that Ethiopia is gonna be headed for stability with this kind of winner takes all kind of politics that we continue to pursue. The elites in that country continue to pursue, although a significant number of people seem to encourage it disturbingly enough. I think in terms of the, you know, like if I'm not an Oromo and I live in Oromia, like I should be comfortable. Absolutely, you know, anybody in Ethiopia should be able to live and work anywhere they want. It is their country after all. I think people also don't realize that because of the way Ethiopia has developed, in Oromia, for instance, the cities we now have were garrison towns where the settler soldiers literally lived. They came speaking Amharic. The local people didn't speak Amharic. The local people had to learn the Amharic language. And so there's that kind of relationship that where everything happens in the city and the local people who live around it are marginal to it. We saw during the Oromo protest, a lot of people were calling for a Babi Yuma. And this is a concept about how to feel like you're also part of the land, that this is also part of your land. So there's this interesting way in which both minorities in Oromia and Oromos are both saying, we don't feel welcome, like we don't feel like we're really free on this land. But again, like Mastish noted, these discussions aren't had in an open forum where it's like, let's hear all the concerns. What are the concerns of minorities in Oromia? What are the concerns of minorities in the South? What are the concerns of the different groups in the South, right? Because I think that because we're not addressing fundamental issues, like the last 30 years has created its own set of issues, right? Because now Amhara people who live in Oromia and elsewhere have specific grievances and specific issues that they want to address. But then there's also this other historical issue that other groups are trying to address. And if each regime only adds on to existing grievances, it just feels like it's really, I don't want to get too pessimistic, but if we don't add to the root causes, you can only stretch this country too far.
I'd like Andom to answer, because I feel like we haven't heard from you for a minute.
Yes, and I want to hear the Eritrean perspective. I think the Ethiopians are taking too much time here.
No, not at all. I mean, I'll combine this with the last question about the dam. Because from the Eritrean side, when we're looking at sort of how Isaias has played this over let's say the last 10 years, only recently did he shift his position on the dam. Before, he was sort of on the Egyptian side. The claims that he had made were that, it wasn't a necessity for Ethiopia, it exceeded its development needs, and that there were sort of motivations in terms of regional geopolitics of Ethiopia wanting to push Sudan and Egypt sort of out of the fray. And so I think it's interesting to see why, Isaias in mid-October is sort of changing, Eritreans are changing their tune around that. On the same trip and where he's visiting the dam, he's also visiting air bases and whatnot. Again, this is prior to the war on Tigray starting. So I think when you want to think about the ways in which Eritrea is involved in this conflict, even though, again, if you're looking at the state media, there's no actual reports coming out from Eritrea around this. There's no sort of affirmations or statements about their involvement. We see clues when we look and connect the dots. And so when we're looking at this, broadening it out from, again, geopolitics and a regional perspective, right? Eritrea doesn't have really much to lose in terms of the Ethiopian issues around the dam with Egypt, right? Eritrea still has good relationships with Egypt, as part of the Saudi UAE alliance in which Egypt is part of, and Eritrea being a sort of client state of Saudi and UAE, which themselves are client states of the West. We see this sort of tiered system working for Eritrea. It's like, all right, they can make the switch. They can agree with Abiy, and they don't lose anything from this, right? They're cool with Ethiopia. If it works out for Ethiopia, they're cool with Egypt. There's nothing. They have no issue with that. And I think connecting that with the diaspora and how we are able to engage with the regime in this way, I think it shows around what actually Eritrean interests are, and if it's able to switch in such a dramatic way, and the actual arguments that the Eritrean government was using prior around development, around trying to push regional powers. I mean, Eritrean government's fickle, right? Eritrean government is going to engage with who it wants to engage with, when it wants to engage with, because again, for them, it's about power, maintaining dominance, and again, understanding the sort of shifting tide of alliances in a region which is facing multiple conflicts, right? Whether it be the dam, whether it be what's going on in Tigray. So for the diaspora, that poses a challenge, because we're dealing with a regime that has no problem, as we've already been speaking about, I know Mark was articulating before, has no problem brutalizing its people. It has no problem forming alliances with those around it, even if it's not in the interest of Eritreans, even if it's not really in the actual sort of political alignment of what the PFDJ believes is right for themselves. Because again, it all comes down to power. And so I think for us in the diaspora, that means that we need to be able to cultivate our own power that exists outside of the regime. We need to be able to construct and create a liberated future that can imagine past Isaias's however many years he has left. Like, what does an Eritrea look like without the PFDJ? One of the, I don't want to say benefits, I say it, not again minimizing what the diaspora and the refugees and migrants struggled through, but because we have so many people in the diaspora throughout the West, all over the world, we just have a lot of skills and power and influence to be able to effectuate change, whether it be, as Samuel was talking about before, contacting members of Congress, contacting elected leaders. We see in New Zealand, right? We now have a member of parliament there. So I think it's about us recognizing the power that we have in the diaspora, because for our brothers, sisters, cousins back home, right, they can't take that risk, right? We know what's going to be facing them if they do something. And so for us, I think it's about being able to build that power. I think even something like a conversation like this, but amongst Eritreans, Ethiopians coming together, is something that is important, particularly for us who are first or second generation, because our parents' generation, those who are part of EPLF, TPLF, whatever revolutionary group we want to talk about, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, this is our fight that we need to be able to usher into the next generation. So I think the ways in which we can build power here in the West, I think that's going to be really important. Some of it can happen electorally through actually what goes on in our own countries. But I think building power, creating organizations that can actually challenge the regime and exist outside the influence of the regime is going to be really, really important for us. And I think we're doing a decent job of it. There's a lot of cynicism and there's a lot of despondency around it, because it's difficult to liberate a place that you can't actually set foot in and have actually foot soldiers on the ground. but that's our challenge, that's our struggle, and you know, we just got to push forward on with it.
Very well said. I'm gonna keep mine really short too, because a lot of it is basically what Andom just said. I think in the diaspora we've always had like dreams of Africa unite. You know what I'm saying? Like the Bob Marley song and whatnot, right? And I think the fact that we were talking about, you know, you talked about the 3 Ws, the water, waste, Wi-Fi. Like we're in America. You know what I'm saying? And so like if us in the diaspora cannot like mimic what we want our home countries to look like, then I feel like that kind of lowers the hope, you know, a little bit. So I think us with all the access and potential that we have, we should be able to mimic how we want the governments to operate back home, and be able to focus on the fundamental issues that do affect us all. Like Andom said, like Makta brought up in the question, the dam. You know, that's something that could positively benefit the whole entire Horn, right? Electricity and all that good stuff. Yeah, I think focusing on what things our government should be focusing on back home, and figuring out ways to bring attention to that, because like Andom said, also the voices out there are pretty much voiceless, especially at times like these. Yeah, that's pretty much all I gotta say.
I just want to jump in real quick again with one other final statement that I was thinking about as you were talking of, and Ayanta, you were mentioning this a little bit before around the discourse, but I also think those of us in the diaspora, we shouldn't be afraid to show solidarity with people outside of our country, outside of our ethnic group. In fact, I wouldn't even say shouldn't be afraid. It should be our imperative to do so, especially when we see injustice. But I think because the conversation can be so toxic, obviously, you know, you want to just recognize your privilege and position. But, you know, I just think it's so important for us to, when we see injustice, to call it out. And it's also to call out people who are saying that we're acting on behalf of, you know, I can't tell you the number of things that I've heard just in the last month of organizations and people that I am acting out on behalf of for, even Sam, bro, after we had our live, man, the DMs were really interesting, but, and I know you deal with that a lot, and I know, you know, everyone throughout the region deals with it a lot, but we have to be, you know, really just unafraid and unabashed in calling that out, and maybe even more so when it's not people who are perceived that they perceive us to be aligned with ethnically. You know, like I had people telling me, saying like, oh, you don't care when there's killings of Amharas or Oromos, and I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, just because you're not necessarily like stalking what I'm posting, or like, how are you able to say that because I maybe take a certain position on what's happening right now in Ethiopia? So that was really, really interesting to me. And I'm hopeful that we can, particularly those of us in the West and the diaspora, can show more solidarity, especially when we're seeing injustice and human rights violations happening.
I can jump in. I echo everything that you guys said. And I think what Andom, you were saying, some of the political organizations already happening, even though you feel like, you know, Eritrea is far away and you can't actually do stuff on the ground. But I think what we can learn from what happened in Ethiopia is that the moment could come in ways that, you know, you never imagined. I mean, I'm not predicting anything, but when it does come, like, honestly, Ethiopia was not ready for it. At least some of the, you know, organizations that were abroad had their some base back home, but what they weren't ready even to imagine what type of demands to put forward to Abiy, Prime Minister Abiy, when he came, because they just accepted, okay, you'll lead us to the transition. Whereas in Sudan, we've seen a slightly different approach. They were like, no, you know, we're not going to trust any military person to. So I think just preparing for that moment when it comes, and what types of demands or even sort of approaches that the stakeholders would ask for, I think is so critical. And I think the tone, also, you just hinted at it, the diaspora is part of the problem as well, not just the solution. I think a lot of the polarization in Ethiopia is actually driven. I mean, just think about where the sources of information are for Ethiopians and Eritreans. Not a lot of media on the ground. A lot of it is also coming from abroad. And so what are we saying to each other? How are we saying them to each other? I think that has a big role to play in terms of where we arrived. For, you know, the diaspora media here based out of BC has done a lot of messaging that is contributing to what's happening in Tigray right now. And the same can be said, about the government media too, but the diaspora is a big part of it. So I think just how do we change the conversation, make it productive, make it somewhat of empathetic, like Ayantu was saying, like we have lost that. And I think that could be a big role. And final thing is just outside of the political space, I think the diaspora could actually just work on skills for young people in Eritrea and Ethiopia. I'm ultimately, this is about them. I mean, ultimately it is about, like you were saying, having access to things so that they can improve their skills and have a better life ultimately. So how can we use the skills that we already have here? And it's not impossible, having engaged with like some projects before, it's not impossible to actually galvanize the type of money and sort of skills and use the whatever resources, internet and whatever, to empower people, empower not in a condescending way, but really give them the skills they need to be better, be better skilled people, and also just ask the right questions. Even having forums like this, I don't know, I feel like that's the work, that's the hard work that needs to be done. And it's gonna take a while, but I think we have the privileges that, we can pull to help contribute that way and neutralize some of the damage we're creating already. So yeah, that's my
point. So of the diaspora, well, first of all, we should say diasporas, because as someone who's been part of Oromo diaspora activism, I've been in this space for almost 10 years now, and the one thing that I noticed is that whenever Oromos are pushing for, whenever they're demanding change, there's always a group that's countering them. And I'm not just talking about government cadres or those people who are directly benefiting from the status quo. I'm just talking about just people on the internet.
I know who you're talking about.
But also, and so this has been like a continuous thing, right? And now I'm watching as Tigray activists are calling out the war. There's another group that's standing against that call and saying the opposite. And I think our contradictions because when we come to the diaspora, what do? We bring our contradictions, we bring our marginalities and privileges and positionalities, because, for instance, the American Congress is so sick of dealing with the Ethiopian diaspora, because one group of people will write a letter and say, this war is excellent, we're trying to get rid of this junta and you should support it. And then you have another group that's like, our families are being destroyed, this war is horrible. So these contradictions, we're a hot mess as a diaspora, because we haven't, again, addressed the root cause. I think that because we have the space to have these conversations, and because we have some privileges, we could be doing the harder work, especially because, as we saw in 2018, the diaspora may not be boots on the ground protesting and all of that, but when it comes down to it, it has a lot of influence. I have mixed feelings about that, but could we have a different kind of diaspora organizing? Could we have a more principle-based? Because we've seen alliances made and fail between different groups. You have groups who work together to bring down the TPLF, EPRDF. Now you have groups who are working together to bring down Abiy. And I'm sure it's the same, in the Eritrean situation, or maybe it's different, I'm not sure. But this kind of it's also, I think, maybe generational. Personally, I'm not interested in being a politician. I'm never going to join a political party. I'm interested in this space because I fundamentally believe that there's an injustice, and I'm connected to that. And I feel like I can be an actor in that, as I work with other people, not necessarily because I think that I'll get something out of it personally. So there's no reason why I shouldn't do what Andom is saying, which is to recognize that injustice is occurring across different groups and that different people are suffering, and to call it out and to be in solidarity. So I hope that that generational difference, especially for those of us who are younger in the diaspora and who are not interested in, who are not like running a political party, should be easier, at least in theory, I think.
I think, just to sort of respond to what people said and add on to it, Ayantu, you mentioned a really interesting point. There are a lot, especially sort of the those that are sort of from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s generation of folks that are in the diaspora. Many of them do sort of have this aspiration of going to Ethiopia and running the country or whatever. I mean, we saw this in the 2005 elections. You had a lot of folks that went back a year or so before the elections and set up political parties, and that really only had real power base in urban areas, but had set up political parties and thought they were going to take over the country, and were more interested in regime change than they were interested in actual building of institutions and building of opportunity and access. And so, I think the diaspora is definitely not a monolithic entity, whether it's the Eritrean or the Ethiopian diaspora or the African diaspora as a whole. I think it is incredibly layered. In some respects, it is very problematic. I think the diaspora is very toxic, but I also think that the diaspora plays a very important role, a helpful role. I mean, I don't know what the remittance numbers are for Eritrea, but Ethiopian diaspora remits billions of dollars to Ethiopia. And you think about, I remember like a decade or so ago, there was a report for one of the G conferences, I think it was the G8 or G20 or whatever, and the African diaspora as a whole sits on over $50 billion of assets. That was over a decade ago. I'm sure the number is higher now. And so there are a lot of great things, even to Mastish's point, that the diaspora can provide technical expertise. I mean, there are so many, just even in our networks, how many Eritreans and Ethiopians do we know who are exceptionally successful in their fields, and they're leading hospitals, and they're elected officials, and they're running for office, and they're investors, and they're doing their thing in different spheres. We have Eritreans and Ethiopians who are athletes and business executives and artists and all sorts of other things in the diaspora. And not just the sort of the well-known ones. I mean, all of us have something to contribute, and so I think there is a real sort of technical skills transfer that can be done. There's a question as to access, whether it's the Eritrea or Ethiopia, just in terms of are there channels for the diaspora to contribute? Especially when you think about repressive governments and sort of how they may view or treat the diaspora, that's an issue. I agree that especially sort of politically, we're not coherent. And so, yeah, that is true. I mean, Congress is, they're annoyed by us. I mean, just frankly, and I've been in numerous meetings over the last few weeks with congressional folks, and just the level of confusion and toxicity, and just sort of how fed up they are with Ethiopians is definitely a true statement. But I think to the point that you mentioned, I think part of this is there's a real lack of creating principled alliances. Sort of what is it that you believe at the core, and that issue, whatever it is that you believe in, how do you bring people together around that, even if they have different opinions, or even if there may be generational trauma or whatever. I think one of the really interesting things that we are seeing now with this war on Tigray is there are Oromos, Tigrayans, and Eritreans that are sort of stepping up together and saying, we are condemning this. You're seeing these protests all over the world now, especially in different national capitals, where you will see the OLF flag with the Tegaru flag, with the Eritrean flag, and with whatever host country flag there is, and it's like, wow, in what world? I mean, I never would have expected, especially sort of the Tigrayan and OLF flags, to be sort of together. That was always sort of weird thing. I mean, it reminded me sort of 2018 when you saw the Eritrean and Ethiopian flags hoisted up together in Asmara and in Addis Ababa. I was like, wow, like in what world are we living in? But politics makes for strange bedfellows, and I think it's important to sort of create strategic alliances around what are the actual goals here. And if the goal is to support and preserve and promote a multinational Ethiopia that is truly inclusive, that is democratic, that is economically just, and that is something that is forward-looking, then those people, regardless of their ethnicity or religion or past misgivings, who believe in that, do need to coalesce and need to do that. I mean, I think, to Andam's point, and we talked about this with our live, and the DMs that I get in the emails. But I mean, this isn't new. I mean, I've been doing this for 15 years. I mean, there have been numerous rumors and insults my way. I mean, I think you don't get into activism, you don't get into politics unless you have thick skin, and because otherwise this stuff will eat you up and you will not be able to sleep at night. And part of it also is, just never read comments, never read anything that anyone has to say about you, because oftentimes these are armchair generals. These are internet warriors who they hide behind fake screen names and just say whatever, but in reality would never have the guts to confront you. So part of this is also, we have to realize, this whole whataboutism culture that we have, and, to the point, speaking out against the injustice that Tigrayans are facing, or the Oromos, or whatever. It's like, well, what about this? Or what about that? And it's like, okay. And then we start going down this rabbit hole of oppression Olympics, which is, again, I tried to allude to it earlier. I mean, you look at Ethiopian history, look at African history. At one point we were all oppressed, at one point we were all oppressors, and let's start looking towards solutions and stop playing like well, you did this to me 200 years ago, so I'm not going to support you in your cause today. And if we keep staying in that bubble, then, I mean, yeah, like if I look long enough in history, I'm sure there's some Oromo warlord that murdered Tigrayans back in the day. I'm sure there is. So am I going to sit around here and say, well, I'm perfectly fine with what Abi's doing in Oromia? Like, no, like you can't continue to sort of relitigate the past. You have to look forward. And so I think that, the diaspora needs to sort of be forward looking in this way, needs to emulate the sort of culture that we would like to see on the continent. There are some who do that very well, and then there are others who actually, again, contribute to the toxicity. But again, with the GERD, for instance, with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, part of the beauty of this, I mean, I swear, GERD is one of the only good things about Ethiopia right now, it's a completely Ethiopian financed project. The diaspora poured in money, the Ethiopian people in Ethiopia, whether you're at home or abroad, people poured in millions of dollars into this $5 billion project. And so, yes, along the way, was it controversial? Yes. Yes, along the way, did the military-industrial complex in Ethiopia contribute to some questionable spending and potential corruption? Sure, yes, we can go down that. But at the end of the day, it manifests a vision that Ethiopians have held not just for decades, but really for centuries, to sort of utilize the Nile River and how to do that. And of course, are there geopolitical implications to it? Of course. I mean, one of the reasons why the Egyptians really hate Ethiopia is because Meles laid the cornerstone to the GERD when Egypt was experiencing the Arab Spring, and it was a perfect opportunity to launch what was Project X. It was a perfect opportunity, and so does Egypt, for instance, stand to benefit from the instability of Ethiopia and the potential disintegration of Ethiopia? Then of course, yes. So you think about the first question that we were all asked. I mean, there are numerous state and non-state actors who seek to benefit from this, including members of the Ethiopian diaspora who may seek to benefit from the fragmentation of Ethiopia or the extermination of a particular identity. And so, I mean, we have to be willing to call people out. We need to be able to call people out on their bullshit, if I can be very, blunt on that. But also, we need to be able to emulate the sort of the sort of expectations that we see for Ethiopia or for Eritrea among ourselves, first and foremost, and to be better organized and be better strategic about it is going to be critical. So I mean, one thing that I've been doing over the last few weeks in particular is I've become more acquainted with other Ethiopians who sort of share this sort of view of perfecting the federation and how to do that. And we've been sharing notes and comparing experiences and learning from each other. And I think that's been really helpful, especially sort of when you look at the digital activism of Oromos over the last 4 years, 5 years. I mean, obviously their numbers are far larger than Tigrayans, but there are certainly lessons that can be learned. And never mind that a lot of Oromos are now retweeting Tagaro activists as well. And so certainly an alliance that has been formed sort of naturally, because we know what this war is truly about. This is not about some law enforcement operation. This is not about eliminating the TPLF junta. I mean, and if it truly was, it's a whole lot of effort to capture 50 people, putting collective punishment. And so these are some of the things that we just need to sort of be aware of. And it concerns me that there are a lot of people, including, rather well-educated people, to Andom's point, that we know that we may sort of respect or may have respected before November 3rd, who are perfectly fine with what's going on right now and will actually go to extreme lengths to defend it. And if you're Western educated, just sitting down and forcefully advocating for such a barbaric war, it's just the cognitive dissonance that, I don't know how to articulate it. And, and my thing has always been, look, if you're for this war, buy a ticket, go to the battlefront and fight it yourself, because, no one stands to benefit from this. And we've seen this, even the unleashing of decades old tensions between Amharas and Tigrayans over lands, in the Welkite area. This is stuff that has been sort of canned for a while. And instead of serving as a peacemaker, Abiy has just exacerbated this. And again, even in the southern region right now, there's conflicts that have led to about 130 people being displaced over the last 3-4 weeks, but no one's talking about it. And so there's just so much that's going on in Ethiopia, in addition to the other crises of COVID-19, locusts, chronic food insecurity, youth unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. You add on all the ethno-religious political crises, constitutional crisis, on top with the sort of natural and human made disasters. It's just, it poses a very explosive situation. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but we do have to be realistic about sort of what path Ethiopia is going on right now. And it is incumbent upon the diaspora, the Eritrean and Ethiopian diaspora, to really denounce things, but also to serve as a source of information, as a source of knowledge, as a source of empowerment. And part of that job for us as Eritreans and Ethiopians is to tell stories. We have the privilege of being here. We are away from these autocrats and their reach. And so we can speak freely and we can speak publicly. We speak English, we are articulate. We have our own connections and our own competencies. And so being able to tell the stories is very important. So I hope we can continue to do that. Oh, also water, waste, Wi-Fi, wheat. That's the food. It took me the entire panel discussion to remember that.
All right, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. I'm so happy that this actually, manifested, and super thankful for the dialogue that was had. Yeah, I just thank you so much.
Thanks for organizing, Maki.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, this was great.
I hope we can do this again. I've learned a lot from you all.
Yeah, I feel like we could probably go on forever, for real. And so I think that's a good thing, though. I think I had a fear that it would be the opposite, but I'm really happy that, we were able to engage. And honestly, I feel like I'm leaving here with more questions than answers. You know what I'm saying? And I think